Welcome to the Fantasy Audiobook. American Comics. Starting Social Security Black Silk Wanda. Chapter 61. Whoosh whoosh. Yelena was breathing heavily after returning to the ground. Just now, she felt as if something was pressing on her lungs, and even breathing was very difficult. This power was too terrifying, and even when she looked at Horde, she was afraid. Was the thing you just cast a spell? Yelena looked at Hod with lingering fear, and even spoke with honorifics. This kind of power was completely contrary to her cognition. She had heard that there were a group of mystics in this world who could cast spells. But this only existed in legends. If she hadn't seen it with her own eyes today, she would even think it was just a joke to fool children. What does this have to do with you? Hodder glanced at the miserable Yelena calmly. It must be said that the violent ups and downs of the chest did have some meaning. But only a little. Just now, in anger, he did use the magic in the scroll of Sithorn. And if he wanted Stark to die in despair, the best thing was to watch his previous experiment lead him into the abyss of death. Reawaken the souls that were slaughtered by Stark and let them return to the world for a short time. The angry souls would inevitably tear Stark to pieces, and even his soul would be devoured by them in the most cruel way. But what made Hodder feel a little regretful was that if it weren't for Gwen, he wouldn't mind taking this guy with him and letting her wander in pain forever. Hodder didn't think he was a good person, he just didn't pursue power and fame. Cough cough cough. Gwen coughed a few times in his arms, and his long eyelashes trembled slightly. Although the horse spell had removed the toxins in Gwen's body, the fear in his memory was not so easy to dispel. In addition, Gwen was quite tired, so he tried his best not to affect Gwen in the battle just now. By the way, the toxin she was infected with is a neurotoxin. It may take some time for it to slowly dissipate. If her physical fitness is relatively strong, she may recover faster. Yelena explained with a slightly apologetic expression. Because this was Gwen she brought back personally, and seeing Hood's worried eyes, she couldn't help but explain. The production of neurotoxin is very expensive. This is a toxin specially studied for people like Gwen. The biggest effect is to reduce the control of the other party's brain over the body, although the body can still maintain its original strength. But because of the brain, there is no way to use it. It's okay, she's fine now. Hod stared at the weak, helpless and pitiful Gwen in his arms, and answered without raising his head. After all, the strongest effect of the horse spell is that it can drive away any external injuries or toxins. Yelena only noticed that Gwen's cheeks were already rosy. She instantly remembered that when Hod picked up Gwen in the underground laboratory just now, a green light flashed on his wrist. You are indeed the mysterious mystic. Yelena covered her mouth with her eyes wide open. She had seen many experiments, so she was very clear about the side effects of the toxin nerves. So now Gwen's body has clearly begun to get better. In other words, this kind of magic really exists in this world. Otherwise, there is no way to explain why this neurotoxin that can only be dissipated by time would disappear. Be quiet, don't disturb Gwen's rest. Hod frowned and turned to look at Yelena with an unhappy look. Gwen was already exhausted, so it was a good thing for her to have a good rest. Yelena shut up immediately after hearing this and didn't dare to continue talking. She had just seen how terrifying Hod was. If she accidentally angered him, he would turn her into the black powder. Woo. Despite this, Gwen slowly opened her eyes. What she saw was the face she had been dreaming about. She could even feel the burning heat of Hood's chest. This was a sense of security she had never experienced before. She even subconsciously rubbed her head against Hood's shoulder. How is it? Are you feeling uncomfortable? Hod nodded slightly and looked at Gwen with concern. He couldn't imagine how scared Gwen was at that time. After all, Gwen was just a freshman. Although she had been saving others, it didn't mean she wasn't afraid. I feel much better. Gwen pursed her lips and nodded, looking at the face so close, her ears slightly red. She felt that she was becoming more and more dependent on Hood, and that strong chest was like the strongest backing. Although her body was already well now, she did not intend to get down from Hood's arms. Even if he held her for a little longer, she would feel an indescribable sense of happiness. Shall we go back now? Hodder took a look around and took the initiative to speak. After all, everything here has been resolved. There is no need to stay here any longer. Wait, but upon hearing this, Gwen actually jumped down from Hood's arms. I just sense that there are still many people imprisoned down there. When she was imprisoned down there, although she couldn't see other places. But from her sensitive senses and the chatter of those people, she also knew that in addition to her, there were many people imprisoned at the bottom. Although she wanted to stay with Hood all the time, she couldn't ignore those people. It seems that my little Gwen still has a strong sense of justice. Hodder smiled and nodded, rubbing Gwen's head. Gwen is always Gwen, and she always considers others. But such a character is very attractive to Hodder. Because he does not have such a delicate heart. Although he also felt those people just now, there were not too many fluctuations in his heart. He wanted to let Yelena go back and release those guys by herself. Since Gwen took the initiative to volunteer, he naturally would not spoil the fun. Let's go, Ms. Yelena, take my Gwen to rescue people. Hod turned his head and looked at Yelena, who was standing aside. Although he could sense the underground passage, he didn't want to play the role of a guide. Since Yelena was here, he was naturally happy to let Yelena do it. Okay, Yelena nodded without hesitation. After all, she also had to go back to collect the remaining information and materials. You are. Gwen had been focusing on Hod just now, and now she noticed Yelena. She took a step back and took a fighting stance with a solemn look. After all, she remembered very clearly that this guy had mocked her. No, no, no. Yelena waved her hands and explained. I was an undercover agent, so I arrested you. She didn't want to fight with Gwen, especially with this terrifying guy next to her. Don't wait to kill yourself. Although she is an undercover agent, she still cherishes her life. What's more, now that Stark is dead, she has no reason to fight with Gwen. Really? Gwen looked at Horde with curiosity. If that was the case, then it could be forgiven. Yes, this guy is an undercover agent. Hodder spread his hands and nodded. Come on, I'll take you down and release those people. Yelena took the lead and walked forward, and the two followed slowly behind her. Because Hood had killed all the guards just now, they went directly in through the main gate and did not see anyone resisting along the way. And because of the loud noise just now, many scientific researchers noticed something was wrong and ran away. Although there are still some research fanatics staying here, Yelena did not indulge them. Even without Hood and others taking action, she stepped forward and quickly dealt with these guys neatly. They are so cruel. Gwen looked at the operating rooms along the way, disgust and nausea lingering in her heart. Because after seeing them, those research fanatics did not leave. Instead, they continued to dissect various things with crazy faces. And these were clearly creatures that were transformed into humanoid forms. Although they still have human skin, their hearts are no different from monsters. There is always a dark side in the world, so we need heroes like you. Hodder sighed, smiled and rubbed Gwen's little head. Because he knew very well that as long as there are interests and rights, there will always be people who will take risks. So this world will always need justice and courage. I really hope that everyone can live in peace. Gwen bit her lower lip. The reason why she has been committed to fighting crime is because of her father's influence. If there were no bad guys, everyone would live and work in peace and not be in constant fear. It will come, there will always be such a day. Hodder did not discourage Gwen's mood, but encouraged her. Because this underground laboratory is for safety reasons, one elevator cannot reach the bottom floor. And each elevator leads to a different area. If it weren't for Yelena's highest authority, it is estimated that they can only use violence to force these passages through. After changing 3 elevators, they finally came to the bottom floor. This is completely different from the cell where Gwen was imprisoned. There are 3 layers of iron cages stacked on the first floor. There are people in each iron cage forged from steel. Because of the lack of space, those imprisoned can only lie down like dogs. And in front of each row of cages is a trough, which seems to feed these people like feeding livestock. Because there is no place to defecate, this floor is filled with a mixture of stench and excrement. Although Hood and his companions came in, but these people did not cheer, instead they stared at them in silence with dull expressions. They had seen too many deaths here, and had accepted their fate of being used as experimental subjects. Resistance would only lead to them being beaten to death, or being put in line to be experimental subjects. Although they had just felt a huge commotion, they did not think anyone would come to save them. Long-term death and sadness had made them lose hope, and they could only numbly endure the pain in their joints. It was estimated that the last time they stood up straight in their lives was when they were pulled out to be experimental subjects. At that time, they could briefly return to their human identity. Among these hundreds of people, there were men, women, young and old, and everyone's eyes were focused on 3 people. It was as if they were watching which of them these 3 people were going to capture as experimental subjects. They are simply a bunch of beasts. Gwen was trembling as she watched this scene. Goosebumps stood up along her back. She could clearly feel the despair of these people. They were clearly treating humans as livestock, as commodities for profit. How could she accept this? Could it be that they really had no humanity left? They didn't even spare children. This is the daily routine of this underground laboratory. Yelena lowered her eyes and spoke with a helpless voice. So you can bear to watch all this happen? Huoda turned his head and looked at Yelena, with a mixed feeling in his tone. I seem to understand the thoughts of those superheroes a little bit. There's no way, I can't do it. Yelena clenched her teeth, her voice seemed to be forced out. She had known for a long time. When she first saw them, her inner thoughts were exactly the same as Gwen's. But after 3 years of undercover work, she was already powerless against these things. She could only watch them die in batches and then be transported in batches. They were just the cheapest experimental subjects, and they couldn't even have their own separate rooms. What could she do? Help them escape? But she didn't have such a strong power at all. She was just one person. She didn't even have a strong power. I'll go to the main control room to open the door for them. Yelena didn't refute in the end, but planned to go to the main control room with a depressed look. Huoda shook his head and raised his right hand slightly. The dark red light was like a flowing silk thread. The silk thread quickly passed through the locks of each cell. When the locks touched the silk thread, they turned into black particles and fell. Come out. You are saved. Gwen stepped forward and shouted at them. When she shouted this, the people in the cage opened their eyes wide. Are we saved? Woohoo. Finally someone comes to rescue us. I want to go home. I don't want to die. Quote. The emotions that had been pent up for a long time burst out at this time, and their faces regained vitality. Fear had been oppressing them all the time, making them lose hope. When these words rang out, their hearts began to beat again. They could finally become human again. As they climbed out carefully, they all hunched over. They couldn't stand up straight for a long time, and even had some pain in their backs. I'll organize it. I will notify the government to take these people in and then send them back to their homes. If they are orphans without families, the government will agree to take them in. Yelena sighed and walked towards these people. Well, I'll leave it to you then. Huoda nodded slightly. In this case, it is most appropriate for the government to intervene. After all, there are many children here, probably orphans who were deceived. Woo woo woo. At this moment, Horde suddenly heard a faint cry coming from the deepest part of the cell. It seems like there are still people who haven't come out yet. Hodder asked with a puzzled look on his face. Logically speaking, they should all have been released. I heard it too, it seemed to be coming from the innermost part. Gwen nodded slightly. Because of Yelena's organization, the rescued victims were now standing together. Unexpectedly, there was still a sound coming from the innermost part. The two looked at each other and simply walked towards the deepest end. And inside was a separate cell, slightly different from the dog cages just now. A woman was curled up in the corner. Green hair, extremely pale face. About 17 or 18 years old. But she looks much smaller than Gwen. Hod always felt that this girl looked familiar, as if he had seen her somewhere. Is this Polaris Lorna? He remembered that Lorna was Wanda's sister. Did you mess with your sister today? I just met Black Widow's sister. Now I met Wanda's. Hod never thought that he would meet Lorna here. To be precise, he really didn't expect that Lorna would exist in this universe. Polaris Lorna is very powerful, although she can't be compared with her father. But the ability to control the magnetic field is already very terrifying. Before coming to this world, he had fantasized that he had this power. After all, it can control everything related to iron. He can even clearly remember the scene of Magneto absorbing iron from a person's body. But thinking that there are ghost spiders in this world, everything seems to make sense. Who are you? Lorna looked up pitifully, her hands wrapped around her legs, her eyes filled with fear. Tears were still flashing in the corners of her eyes, and even her body was shaking slightly. She couldn't even imagine whether they were going to draw her blood for research again. Don't be afraid, we are here to save you. We have eliminated all the Hydra here. Hod lowered his voice and explained in a gentle tone. At this time, Lorna was still very vulnerable. So he even spoke more gently, for fear of scaring this little girl. Are they all dead? Lorna raised her head, and excitement flashed in her brown pupils. She thought she would be locked here as an experiment for the rest of her life. But she didn't expect that she would be saved at this time. The moment she raised her head, her eyes were immediately locked on Hood's face. It was a gentle and handsome face. She couldn't help but sigh that this man was so handsome. Well, so you can rest assured. Hod nodded slightly and answered Lorna with an affirmative tone. It is not easy for a little girl to endure fear. No wonder Lorna's mood changed drastically later. Can I leave now? Lorna's eyes widened, her voice choking. She had imagined this scene countless times, but it never happened. Now when she heard the news, her heartbeat accelerated slightly. Even her body couldn't help shaking. She slowly stood up with the help of the wall, and the only thing left in her mind was the desire for the outside world. Well, we'll take you home. Hod moved aside the door and smiled at the incredulous Lorna. After being locked up in such a place for a long time, freedom must have become the most desired thing. Home. When Lorna heard this word, her eyes drooped. I no longer have a home. Her originally joyful heart was covered by sadness. Pain filled her heart. Yes, even if she left here, she no longer had a home. Where could she go? It was just a change of cage. Hotter. Gwen grabbed the corner of Hood's clothes and whispered with pity, she is so pitiful. She could feel Lorna's pain. Although she always had her mother Helen, her father was asleep, which made her immersed in pain. But Lorna didn't even have a home, so she must be more miserable. Hod just nodded slightly. In fact, he was also having a headache about what to do. It was impossible to leave Lorna to Yelena. Once Lorna's ability was exposed, despair would inevitably await Lorna. Those guys in the upper echelons would never let go of such power. So it was absolutely impossible to hand Lorna over to Yelena. Hod, why don't we take her back? Gwen hesitated for a long time, then held Hod's hand and acted like a spoiled child. Her family definitely couldn't afford to support another person. But Hod was different. He had a big villa. And there were quite a few rooms. Even if he took Lorna back, it wouldn't matter. What's more, Hod's wealth wouldn't be a big deal even if he supported another person. Me. Lorna raised her eyes that were sparkling with tears, and looked at the two of them in disbelief. She didn't expect that someone would be willing to adopt her at this time. After all, she was already 16 years old. Logically speaking, this was most likely to let her find a way to survive on her own outside. Hood didn't expect that Gwen would take the initiative to say this. After all, he had also thought about letting Wanda and Lorna recognize each other. They were half-sisters. And if they went to his place, they would have someone to take care of them. But thinking about how to start the conversation just now was a problem. After all, it was not appropriate to say in front of Gwen that he would take other girls back. But if Gwen took the initiative to speak, it would be completely different. If possible, he would naturally nod and agree. This might even bring Wanda a surprise. Click, click. At this time, hurried footsteps came from behind. Looking back, I saw Yelena trotting to them. I have contacted the people above and will bring someone to take over soon. You may have to leave early. Yelena also knew that Hood probably didn't want to reveal his identity. Otherwise, she would definitely have heard of Hood. And once the people above come to take over, if there is any friction, things will get out of hand. Then let's leave here first. After nodding his head, Hood took the initiative to help the thin Lorna up. Let's go, I'll take you home. Since the decision has been made, there is no need to hesitate too much. When he helped Lorna, he found that Lorna was very light, and she was not the weight of an adult girl at all. Although Lorna didn't know who the man in front of her was, she felt trust in him at this moment. It was a feeling that was hard to describe, as if this man would never deceive her. But as soon as she took a step with the help of someone, her legs softened and she almost fell to the ground. Hood could tell at a glance that this was due to long-term malnutrition, and with the blood drawn, she probably had trouble walking. He didn't hesitate too much and directly carried Lorna horizontally. "Let's go. Let's leave first." After saying that, he opened the dimension door. Just as he took Gwen across the golden light circle, the system's voice sounded in his mind. "Ding. You made Baron Strucker pay for his crimes and saved all the poor souls in the lab. Get reward. Magnetic field control. Magnetic field control." Hood was stunned. He really didn't expect that he would get this reward. This is the same ability as Lorna, Magneto. Although it was weakened in the movie, in fact this ability is extremely terrifying. However, Hood did not focus all his attention on the reward, but on Lorna in his arms. In just over a minute, Lorna fell asleep. It was probably because she was too sleepy and tired in the underground laboratory for a long time, and her physical condition was very poor. After all, that group of scientific research lunatics would definitely keep drawing her blood. There was no need to think about eating. With their attitude towards experimental subjects, it was already very good to be able to barely survive. If it weren't for Lorna's magnetic field control, it would be estimated that she would be the same as those people in the cage. Just after relaxing, she fell asleep immediately. "Poor little girl," Gwen said with a sympathetic tone while standing aside. Although she was about the same age as herself, she was really pitiful. She was a little jealous at first, but when she saw Lorna like this, the jealousy in her heart dissipated. She was really too weak, so there was nothing she could do about it. And what followed was a further improvement in her favorability towards Hood. Because the request she had just made was actually too much, but Hood agreed without hesitation. At least this girl had a family at this moment. Imelda. After opening the door and returning to the villa, Hood put Lorna in the guest room and called Imelda over. "Take good care of this girl. If she has any needs, satisfy her." "Okay." Imelda nodded respectfully. "Gwen, let me take you home first." Hodder turned to look at Gwen beside him and held her hand. "Are we going back now?" Gwen was a little reluctant. After all, they had only met for a short time. "Your parents are very worried about you now." After all, Gwen's parents are probably still looking for Gwen everywhere. It's pitiful that parents in the world would not keep Gwen here just for their own selfish desires. Besides, it's not like they don't have time to meet. "I almost forgot." Gwen slapped her head and became anxious. She had forgotten that her parents were still waiting for her to go home. She hadn't gone home last night, and they must be very anxious now. Hood took Gwen to sit in the Bumblebee and drove quickly towards Queens. "Is there still no news about Gwen?" Helen wiped her tears with her handkerchief. Her eyes were already bloodshot. She had been looking for her for a whole day, but there was still no news. It was as if she had disappeared out of thin air. Although the surveillance cameras had been checked, the last thing she saw was the man who appeared today sending Gwen to the station. Then the surveillance camera suddenly had problems, and the rest of the footage could not be seen at all. "I have asked people to investigate as much as possible, and there should be news." George lowered his head and took a deep puff of cigarette. The ashtray in front of him was already full of cigarette butts. He didn't say much, but kept sighing. He didn't know if it was because of him that his daughter was in danger. Because he was a policeman, he had caught too many criminals. If someone wanted to seek revenge, it was not impossible. If this was really the case, then his daughter was probably in danger. "I've said it before, sometimes you shouldn't work in this dangerous industry. If my daughter is gone, woo." Helen couldn't help crying. She couldn't imagine what her daughter would go through. She had said before that it was too easy to make enemies in the police industry. Her daughter was so well behaved that she would definitely not take the initiative to cause trouble. Her daughter was really weak, helpless and pitiful. She was just a little girl who was powerless. "Dad, Mom." Just then, a voice sounded at the door. The two raised their heads instantly, and when they saw Gwen standing outside the door, their eyes widened. "You're back. Are you okay? Why didn't you go home last night?" Helen walked up quickly, grabbed her daughter's hand, and looked her up and down. George, who was not good at expressing his emotions, had red eyes and opened his mouth slightly, but he couldn't say a word. "Are you in any danger?" George stepped forward and spoke slowly with a choked voice. He knew that his daughter was definitely not staying out all night. Because the surveillance cameras in the surrounding blocks were damaged too suddenly. This must have been premeditated. I accidentally met a human trafficker yesterday. This is what Hood had told Gwen in the car. After all, he disappeared too suddenly to say that he was staying overnight at a friend's house. In addition, he knew that George was a policeman, so he would definitely check the surveillance. If he used this excuse, it would be hard to explain. Human traffickers. George's heart was immediately in suspense when he heard this. How did you escape? Because he had seen how dark this world was. Many human traffickers would try every means to abduct girls. And once caught, they would definitely face an extremely terrifying situation. It might even be impossible to escape in their lifetime, they might even become a pile of parts. It was Mr. Hood who saved me. Gwen looked at Hood standing beside her and took the initiative to explain. Mr. Hood used a lot of connections to save me. Because she knew that sooner or later she would introduce Hood to her parents. With the character of her father George, he would definitely find ways to investigate Hood's identity. So it is better to just say it directly. And it was indeed Hood who rescued her. Hearing this, the anxious Stacy and her husband noticed Hood standing aside. The moment they saw Hood, they suddenly remembered that this was the young man this morning. It's you. Helen's eyes widened. Although Hood said it resolutely today, she still didn't believe it. Although George woke up when Hood went to the ward, she didn't think it was Hood's credit. But she didn't expect that Hood would find her daughter at this time. Thank you so much, my friend. George stepped forward and held Hood's right hand. Although Hood was just a young man, saving his daughter was enough for him to thank him. You're welcome. I'm Gwen's friend, and this is what I should do. Hodder smiled and continued, I was planning to visit you two today. Oh, right, you forgot to bring these two things back. Helen suddenly remembered that the young man seemed to have left something here when he came. This is the benefit of our China, and it is a gift specially brought to you two. Huoda smiled and explained. Although gifts are given abroad, etiquette and the like are not taken too seriously. Thank you so much, come in and sit down, I'll go cook now. Helen realized at this time that this person might be the one her daughter liked. Otherwise, the other party would not try his best to help her find her daughter. Come in quickly. George also took the initiative to invite Hood to come in and sit down. You sit down first, I'll call the police station. After all, there are still many people who are trying to help him find Gwen. Now that he has found his daughter, he naturally has to inform them. Hood also sat down on the sofa under the warm hospitality of the two. Although Hood wanted to help cook later, Helen asked Hood to go back to sit on the sofa on the pretext that the kitchen was too small. As for George, he was more and more satisfied with Hood. After all, this young man looked good in appearance and family background. The most important thing is that he is very dedicated to his daughter. After the meal, Stacy and his wife took the initiative to pick up food for Hood at the table. They also saw Gwen's feelings for Hood, but they didn't say it, just smiled and said nothing. I will leave now. Thank you for your hospitality. After the dinner, Huoda also said hello and left. Mom and Dad, I'll go see Hood off. Gwen blushed and called out, quickly walking downstairs with Hood. I'll go back first. Just as Hood was about to open the car door, Gwen pulled Hood over. A soft touch was imprinted on his lips. The fragrance of her body came with it. For a moment, the two seemed to forget everything and hugged each other on the street without paying attention to anyone else. Huoda. A familiar voice sounded. Huoda turned around and saw a figure in red standing under the yellow street light not far away. She looked at the two people with only shock in her expression. You. Wanda froze in place, staring blankly at everything that had just happened. The man she loved so much was kissing someone else as if no one was around. At that moment, her heart ached so much that she even felt a little breathless. Her eyes were red, her body was shaking uncontrollably, and she just stared blankly at everything that happened. Although she wanted to say something, the only sound that came out was sobs. She had thought about whether Hood would abandon her, but it happened too quickly. She simply couldn't accept this result. Have I been abandoned? The reason why she appeared here was because she had finished the trivial matters in the Avengers base. She wanted to call Hood, but she wanted to give Hood a surprise, so she went directly to the manor. But as soon as she arrived at the manor, she learned that Hood had taken Gwen out. She thought that Gwen's home should be in Queens, so she planned to come and look for her. But she didn't expect that when she saw Hood just now, this scene appeared. She gasped for breath, and tears kept rolling in her eyes. Wanda, listen to my explanation. After Hood realized what was happening, he quickly spoke first. He had originally wanted to wait until their relationship got a little closer before revealing the news. I went to your house to look for you. But I couldn't find you. Wanda looked painful, and even her speech was somewhat intermittent. She tried her best to remain calm, gritting her teeth and looking at Hood. This scene has already happened, and no matter how she explained it, there was absolutely no way to change the facts. In fact, she had vague guesses before, but she was unwilling to accept the reality before she actually saw it. For example, when she was at Hood's house, she had actually heard the voice. But she was willing to believe Hood's lies and no longer pursue the source of the girl's voice. When they went to the supermarket together, she had already felt that Hood seemed to be a little bit wrong. But she could also pretend that she knew nothing, and she didn't even dare to investigate the truth further. So much so that even when catching the snake, she smelled Gwen's perfume on Hood. But she still secretly persuaded herself that she was just too suspicious. But when she saw this scene, she could no longer control her emotions. Hood gritted his teeth, his mind was spinning rapidly, trying to say something. However, the fact had already happened, and the explanation would indeed become very pale. Buzz. Wanda gritted her teeth and clenched her fists. The surrounding green belts and trees were inexplicably turbulent. Even the evening breeze suddenly became stronger at this time, blowing slowly. Large pieces of fallen leaves scattered from the trees and floated between the two. It was as if there was a barrier, and the two were just looking at each other from a distance. You two. Gwen looked at the scene, and even if she was dumb, she could see that something was wrong. These two people were definitely not just friends. It was just that she had never thought about it in this way before. But at this moment, she understood that she was most likely the third party. Otherwise, how could Wanda live in Hood's house when she could obviously live in the Avengers base? Even such a private matter as taking clothes was asked to Hood. I'm fine. Wanda's expression suddenly became extremely calm, and a crimson light surrounded her. When people are extremely sad, their psychological defense mechanisms will be triggered. The next moment, she rushed into the sky with terrifying power. She had already understood that she should have guessed that someone like Hood would not be satisfied with just one person. Besides, she didn't even have a reason to stop it. Because the relationship between them has always been unclear. It's just that she has never been willing to admit it. Now seeing all this happening, she has completely accepted her fate. Maybe she is not qualified to be loved. All this is just her own idea. Sorry, Gwen. Hood grabbed Gwen's shoulders and said, this matter is a bit complicated. I'll explain it to you another day. After that, he suddenly soared into the sky and chased in the direction where Wanda disappeared. No matter what, we must keep an eye on Wanda now. God knows what Wanda will do in this situation. He knows very well that Wanda's mental state is extremely fragile. Whoosh! Wanda sensed the magical fluctuations behind her, and determination flashed in her eyes. The crimson light burst out again, and the flying speed became faster. The whole person was like a meteor, passing through the sky with a bright crimson light. Mom, look, there's a shooting star in the sky. A little girl wearing a thick windproof jacket pulled her mother to look up at the sky. Yes, there are actually 2 shooting stars. Make a wish quickly, maybe it will come true. The woman raised her head and also saw the crimson light passing through the night sky. Looking up at the deep sky, the sky gradually darkened as the sun set. 2 bright shooting stars passed through, one scarlet and one dark red. Passers-by on the street were attracted by this light. They all looked up, and when they saw this scene, they couldn't help but close their eyes and make a wish. This was the first time they saw 2 shooting stars passing by. Many people even picked up their mobile phones to take pictures. For them, this is a rare scene. High in the sky. Suburbs. Wanda, wait for me. Hood gritted his teeth and chased after her, grabbing Wanda's right hand. It must be said that after these days of getting along, he has developed feelings for Wanda. Although she is a little arrogant at ordinary times, she will agree to her requests. After seeing Wanda's soft heart, he is unwilling to give up just like that. Let me go. Wanda shook off Hood's right hand, and her eyes burst into red light. Her charming face showed an extremely dangerous sense of crisis. Buzz. The next second, a large amount of crimson light instantly wrapped around Hood. The dazzling light seemed like a charming firework blooming in the night sky. Listen to me, Hood waved his right hand, and the Phoenix Force emerged to block him. He could feel that Wanda was really angry now. The rich crimson light was constantly entwined around him. Just like a python, the force of contraction was getting stronger and stronger. So much so that the Phoenix Force that formed the barrier actually showed signs of slight shattering. I don't want to hear your explanation. You liar. Wanda took a deep breath and pulled with her right hand. Hood was like a bowling ball and hit the ground hard. Bang! In an instant, countless dust rushed into the sky. Even the ground shook slightly. Seeing Hood being pulled down, she couldn't help but feel a pang in her heart. But she knew very well that Hood would be fine with such strength. Sure enough, Hood flew up again. I've already said it. Don't bother me anymore. The crimson light on Wanda's body burst out again, and the violent rays flashed dazzlingly in the sky. This light, with huge energy, instantly hit Hood's barrier. Cracks appeared on the barrier that was not deliberately maintained. Wanda, I know you hate me, but I'm too big, there's nothing I can do. Hood took a deep breath and shouted with gritted teeth. Wanda, who was a little worried, instantly became furious. This guy, at this time, was still thinking about hugging left and right. The chaos magic in his hand was further output, and Hood's barrier with the power of the Phoenix was pressed into the hill below. This girl is really angry. Hood was lying on the ground, feeling the surging crimson light impacting the Phoenix Force and shaking his head helplessly. But he really didn't expect that Wanda would look for him everywhere. And he was lucky enough to see that scene, which made him not know where to start explaining. He could even vaguely feel that the crimson light released by Wanda now was stronger than when she dealt with Agatha. Call. Wanda retracted her crimson glow and gasped for breath. She was so angry that her blood boiled. She was very conflicted at this moment. She wanted to give up Hood without hesitation. But when she thought about how good Hood was to her, her heart ached. But when she thought about how it would always be like this in the future, she felt even more unwilling. Wanda, I really have no choice. The physical fitness of the people in our Huo family is obvious. Huoda flashed and appeared in front of Wanda. To be honest, after all, the rewards from the system really made him awesome. You were really shameless. Wanda's right hand was wrapped in crimson light, and she slapped Hood's abdomen fiercely. But at the moment of approaching, she did not see Hood dodge, and subconsciously retracted the crimson light. Bang! With a slap on the abdomen, Hood fell straight down. Boom! With a loud noise, thick dust flew up, instantly covering Hood below. Why doesn't this guy hide? Wanda gritted her teeth and frowned. She had just held back and didn't use her strength. But she didn't expect that Hood wouldn't even try to stop her. She couldn't help but cast her eyes to the ground, but there was no movement on the ground. Is this guy okay? Wanda looked at the slowly falling dust below, and her heart tightened. It shouldn't be like that. She didn't use too much strength just now. She even retracted the crimson light. Even if an ordinary person was hit, it would only hurt slightly. And this guy's body is as strong as vibranium. Even if he really fell from a high altitude, there would definitely be no problem. Don't pretend, get up now. Wanda took a deep breath and shouted to the people below. But there was no response from below. Is he going to die? Wanda suddenly had this thought in her mind. If Hood's ability was to activate the power actively, then he might really get into trouble if he fell down. What made her even more frightened was that there was no fluctuation of the living creatures below. Hood, her heart suddenly lifted up, and she quickly fell downward. Although she didn't like Hood's deception, she didn't want to see Hood get into trouble. If something really happened, she would regret it for the rest of her life. When she was about to fall to the ground, she suddenly raised a gust of wind with her right hand, sweeping away all the dust. Hood was lying on the ground, without any reaction, and even his chest didn't move at all. It was as if he was dead. Hotter. Wanda's face changed drastically, and she threw herself on Hodder. She could no longer feel Hodder's breath. Her heart became extremely anxious at this moment. She lay on Hodder's body, ready to listen to Hodder's heartbeat. Hodder suddenly moved, and then he embraced her in a warm embrace. You lied to me again. Wanda wanted to struggle to leave, but her hands were powerless. Tears fell from the corners of her eyes, but she slowly closed her eyes. After a while, Hood finally let go of Wanda. You're playing tricks on me again. Wanda's anger had faded a lot. She was so angry that she hit Hood hard. It really hurts. I feel like I'm in so much pain here. Hood covered his abdomen and looked at Wanda with a painful expression. I can hurt you. Wanda didn't believe it. She knew Hood's physical fitness best. This guy was thick-skinned and tough, how could he be? And that just now, I didn't scare my hands to death at all. If you don't believe me, feel it. Hodder had a painful look on his face, gritted his teeth, and looked trembling all over. Wanda saw that his expression was very real, and she rubbed her abdomen doubtfully. Here. You are not angry anymore. Hodder was so happy that he smiled. Liar again. Wanda was so angry, but the haze in her heart also dissipated a little. Actually, I love you very much, but... Hood hugged Wanda and looked at her with sincere eyes. I'm sorry, but I can't give up Gwen. Wanda gritted her teeth and struggled in her heart, but every time she saw Hood's face, her heart softened. After a long time, Wanda opened her red lips and slowly said, I don't care about you, anyway, you must never abandon me in the future. She knew very well that she couldn't bear to leave Hood at all. In this case, she could only accept her fate honestly. It was enough to just hope that Hood would not abandon her in the last minute. Don't worry, I swear to God. Hodder grinned and raised his hand to swear. Well, you don't need to swear, I believe you. Wanda grabbed Holder's hand and said with a pout. The moonlight enveloped them and they had unknowingly flown to a strait. By the way, do you think this place is beautiful? Not only is the scenery beautiful, but there is no one within a radius of dozens of miles. Wanda heard the meaning of his words and became shy. At the same time, on the streets of Manhattan, New York, two extremely graceful figures were constantly fighting. The two collided quickly, making a series of fighting sounds. In the end, the two kicked each other at the same time, kicking each other back and apart. Yelena, what are you doing in New York? Natasha stared at the familiar figure opposite her with a vigilant look. It was her sister Yelena. She had just received a notice that her spy noticed Yelena's appearance in Manhattan. It was for this reason that she rushed over as soon as possible. I am a legal citizen and entered the country legally. Yelena spread her hands, shrugged her shoulders and said indifferently, besides, is that how you treat tourists who come to New York? I won't just believe what an agent says. Natasha knows her sister's character. She wouldn't come to New York for no reason. If there is no conspiracy, then it's really weird. Looking for someone. Yelena's fiery red lips slightly raised, and she raised her eyebrows mysteriously. After returning to the organization yesterday, she was ordered to investigate Hood, even before S.H.I.E.L.D. and other organizations. After all, it was obvious that Natasha and S.H.I.E.L.D. did not know Hood's true identity. She could take this opportunity to find out Hood's identity in advance. If she could get closer to Hood, it would be a great thing for the organization. Who? Natasha asked with a frown on her face and a vigilant look. But Yelena spread her hands and said in a provocative tone. You guess. The next morning, a ray of morning sunlight fell on the sea. Under the golden light, the sea surface was like a piece of fish scales reflecting light. Although it was a bit dazzling, it seemed so peaceful and tranquil. Hood and Wanda lay on the big bed, their cheeks were slightly reddened by the sun. They looked at each other, and a smile appeared on their lips. You were really bad, never mind, you might be right. Wanda exhaled. Although she was a little unwilling, it didn't seem so bad after thinking about it. At most, she would have another sister to chat with in the future. It just so happened that she didn't have any good friends in the Avengers. Which, you are still the best. Hood hugged Wanda and kissed her hard on the face. It was his honor to meet such a good witch. After breakfast, Hood remembered that Lorna was still in the manor. By the way, I have another surprise for you. Hood whispered to Wanda who was leaning on him. He didn't forget Lorna. After all, She was Wanda's sister, and she would definitely be very happy. The witch valued her family, relatives and friends more than anything else, and she was very lonely inside. Surprise. Wanda was stunned, and then she sat up straight and looked Hood up and down. Are you sure you are not frightened? You don't have other women you haven't told me, do you? She just said that it would be good to have more sisters, and she didn't want to drop a bomb on her. If so, she would be really upset. Although it would be good if he just didn't abandon her, he couldn't go too far. Forehead. The corner of Hod's mouth twitched. It's a surprise anyway. He couldn't understand why this woman's sixth sense was so accurate. He even suspected that women had spider sense. She had already expressed his thoughts before she even opened her mouth. This made him feel a little embarrassed for a moment. It would be better. Wanda pouted and stared at Horde angrily. Buzz. At this time, the mobile phone on the table suddenly began to vibrate continuously. Well, I understand. Wanda answered the phone with a serious look and then hung up. What's wrong? Hodder also noticed the serious look on Wanda's face and asked in confusion. After all, Wanda usually doesn't have such a serious expression. Just now Natasha said she had something important to discuss with me. Wanda held Hood's hand, with an apologetic look on her face. Sorry, the surprise can only be seen when I am free. After all, Natasha's tone was so serious, it was definitely not a trivial matter. Although she said she wanted to stay with Hood, she couldn't let go of the Avengers. Maybe they are in a serious situation and need her help. Okay, then you go ahead and do your work. Although Hood was a little unwilling, he knew Wanda's character very well. And this should be related to the German mission. After all, Captain America is on the side of the Winter Soldier. God knows what will happen next. It can be said that the only one who can make Steve lose his rationality is Bucky, the Winter Soldier. By the way, can't you tell me what your surprise is in advance? Wanda turned to Hood and asked with a curious look. She was very curious about what surprise Hood had prepared for her. This is a surprise. Hood pretended to be mysterious, with a smile on his face. I'll tell you when you come to the manor tonight. He believed that Wanda would be very surprised when she saw Lorna again. Tisk, if you don't want to tell me, then don't tell me. Wanda snorted, crossed her arms, and looked disdainful. She suspected that Hood was just trying to trick her into living in the manor. Not only was this guy like a calf, he would be bored if he didn't work the fields for a day. Okay, go get busy first. Hood ruffled Wanda's fluffy hair. After dealing with Wanda, he put down the worry in his heart. See you later in the evening. Wanda did not continue to refuse and flew out from the balcony. It seems I have to go back first. After watching Wanda leave, Hood stretched and staggered downstairs. This is his villa on the beach, but it is basically idle here. Although the scenery at the beach is better, the sea breeze is sticky and moist, and it is not as comfortable as the manor after all. Before leaving, he did not forget to call Imelda and ask someone to come and clean up the villa. After all, because this place is not often lived in, basically someone will come to clean it once every 3 days. Inside the manor, Hood stepped out of the dimensional gate and came to the southwest corner of the yard. After unlocking the door with fingerprints, he was about to go in when he suddenly felt a sense of crisis. He subconsciously moved a step to the right, and then reached out with his left hand. An iron bowl wrapped in green light fell into his hand. He subconsciously looked up, only to see Luna stretched out her hand and looked at Hood blankly. I'm sorry, Mr. Hodder, I didn't mean it. Lorna said awkwardly, touching the back of her head and said, I just wanted to test my ability. When she was in the laboratory before, although she knew she had the ability, she didn't have many opportunities to test it. It's okay. Hood grinned and put the iron fist in his hand on the table beside him, but you look much better. He also noticed that Luna's cheeks were much rosier than when he saw her yesterday. I haven't slept so comfortably in a long time, and this is all thanks to Sister Imelda. Lou stirred her hair and looked at the ground with rosy cheeks. She has never been very outgoing, so she didn't even dare to look directly at Horde. And it must be said that she hasn't slept in such a comfortable bed for a long time. As long as you like her. Hod stepped forward and rubbed Lorna's head. He had to say that he liked this little girl very much. Although she looked a little introverted, she looked shy. By the way, Mr. Hood, my name is Lorna. Lorna seemed to have remembered something and hurriedly introduced herself. Because after returning yesterday, she fell asleep in Hood's arms. So she forgot the most important thing. The reason why she knew Hood's name was entirely because Imelda told her. Okay, we are a family from now on, don't be so restrained. Hodder couldn't help but smile knowingly when he saw Lorna tugging at the corner of her clothes. By the way, what is your current ability? Hodder remembered that Luna was trying to use her ability just now, and suddenly remembered this. He was also very curious about how much difference Luna was now from the North Star in his impression. My ability is magnetic control. Lorna raised her head and answered in a hurried tone. To be precise, my ability is only effective on metal. As if she might be scolded if she answered slowly. Magnetic control. Faced with Lorna's answer, Hod was stunned for a moment before he understood. Lorna didn't understand her true ability yet. This should be called magnetic field control, but because she was too young, she hadn't fully developed it. In fact, your power is more than that. Hod bent slightly and explained in a friendly tone, you can try hard. This is the famous North Star in the future, but he just hasn't figured out how his ability works. Huh, Lorna seemed a little confused, not quite understanding what Hood meant. Try it again, I'll see if I can explain it to you. Hod stood beside Lorna so that he could see more directly when Lorna used her ability. In addition, he already had this ability, so it would be easier to teach her. Well, okay, Lorna nodded fiercely, slowly stretched out her hands and clenched her teeth. Then the iron bowl not far away was lifted up. It was as if there was an invisible hand, but this hand could not control the bowl very well. Even when it was floating, it felt like it was going to fall at any time. After a long while, Lorna put down the bowl floating in the air with a solemn expression. Phew. After she finished all this, she looked at Hood beside her with satisfaction, waiting for praise. Good, well done. Hood smiled and rubbed her head, then said, we have to change to a heavier one, the iron statue outside. Looking at Luna's contrasting appearance, he couldn't imagine that this was the crazy Polaris later. But he could understand it, because Polaris's family all have mental illnesses. Normally, it's okay, but once they encounter certain stimuli, their mental state will change. For example, Polaris actually has two personalities, so he became so crazy later. That, Lorna looked in the direction of Hood's finger, pursed her lips and said hesitantly, that's too heavy, I can't lift it. She had tried it before, but at most she could just levitate the object, not very powerful. Being able to levitate for a while was already very good, there was no way to achieve precise control. Not to mention something that heavy, it was impossible to move it even a little bit. I believe in you, you can give it a try. Hod looked at Lorna beside him with trust. Lorna's ability is far more than this, so he believes that Lorna can definitely do it, but because she doesn't have enough faith. Really, Lorna met Hood's encouraging gaze, and a hint of confidence emerged in her eyes. Since the gentleman in front of her said it was possible, then it must be possible. She was willing to believe this man who brought her an indescribable good feeling. Because she believed that this man would definitely not lie to her. She looked sideways, and her right hand emitted a soft and strange green light. The green light spread and flowed in her hand, and the iron statue in the distance began to tremble slowly. It really works. She gritted her teeth, and the iron statue weighing tons actually trembled and slowly rose a little bit. Although it was only about 1 centimeter, Hod still captured it clearly. Try harder, a little higher. Lorna gritted her teeth. Bang! The next second, the heavy iron statue hit the ground hard, making a loud noise, and dust and smoke flew everywhere. Even the eagle wings on it were flapping continuously. I cannot make it. Lorna frowned and panted, shaking her head helplessly. She already felt that she was exhausted. This was her best effort, and it could even be said that she had broken the previous record. You still have a lot of room for improvement. Hod pinched the collagen-filled face to comfort him. He knew how strong Lorna was, and this was less than 1% of her. But this was also within his expectations. After all, she was only 16 or 17 years old. It was already very good to be able to do so much. And he didn't want to increase Lorna's strength in a way that would make her collapse. Having strength was just to enable Lorna to have the power to protect herself in the future. Thank you. Lorna's eyes flashed with reluctance, and then she said, but the demons in the laboratory said that my ability will not improve much. She had been tested before, and even if she continued to practice, at most she could only make her operation more delicate. It was nothing more than controlling some not very heavy objects to attack others. This ability was not even as good as a gun, so she had never thought about becoming stronger. It was good enough to be able to help a little more in daily life. No matter how unwilling she was, this was already her limit. In her opinion, Horde was just comforting her. Who said that? Hod retracted his hand and said calmly, your ability is magnetic field control, which is one of the most powerful means. Magnetic field control. Lorna was stunned for a moment. This was completely different from what she had imagined. She had never thought that her ability was not magnetic force control, but this so-called magnetic field control. This was completely beyond her expectations. Hood did not continue to explain, but opened his hands lightly. He looked at the iron statue in the yard with a calm expression. Buzz buzz buzz. At this moment, Lorna on the side suddenly widened her eyes. Your ability. She clearly felt an extremely familiar power in Hood. This is magnetic field control. And this power is extremely powerful. If she is described as water in a bowl, then Hood's power at this time is like an unfathomable ocean. And this released power did not have any light. Only the slight fluctuations in the air could be vaguely seen. She did not expect Hood to know this trick. Creak. Hood just pinched his right hand, and the statue began to compress and deform continuously. It was as if it was constantly squeezed by something, and the steel made a harsh sound when it was squeezed. And under the huge pressure, it even turned directly into a large piece of iron. Wow, this scene made Luna's eyes widen. She had never thought that this power would be so strong. Magnetic field control can control more than just metal materials. Hod's voice was calm, and he could clearly feel the power flowing in his body. Unlike Lorna, he got the magnetic field control of a mature body. Although it was not as powerful as Magneto in the comics, it was more than enough to match Magneto in the movie. It can even be said that Magneto's control was not even as strong as his. Not just metal? Lorna asked with a puzzled look. She didn't quite understand the meaning of this word. Hood knew that explanations would not help much, so he turned his palm downward. His arm was trembling slightly, and a terrifying force burst out and spread in the air. The ground was shaking, and the ground began to crack, and even dozens of cracks could be seen spreading towards the distance at a very fast speed. The ground was constantly rubbing, making a terrifying sound like a monster's roar. The trees and lawns fell to the ground one after another as if they were pressed by something. The clear sky suddenly became dark. Black clouds covered it. Due to the abnormal magnetic field, thunder flashed in the deep space. The ground was constantly shaking, as if an extremely terrifying earthquake had occurred. Oh my God, Lorna felt that the power is tens of thousands of times stronger than mine. At the same time, Meteorological Bureau. Beep beep. Report to the commander, there is something wrong. A staff member shouted in a terrified voice. What's wrong? The officer asked in a serious tone. The staff member shouted in a fearful tone. The crust of the earth in New York suddenly intensified its movement and began to split continuously. This may be a historic earthquake. The officer focused his eyes on the screen. When he saw the numbers on it, his hair stood up. Goosebumps quickly spread down his back, and his pupils shrank rapidly at this moment. Because the screen showed an 8.0 magnitude earthquake. Notify everyone to evacuate immediately. He shouted as he quickly sent the message through the computer via text message. The earthquake had just occurred, so there should be a little time for evacuation. And the location was actually in New York. If it was really a magnitude 8.0 earthquake, the consequences would be disastrous. It was obvious that such a severe earthquake would not occur here. The Meteorological Bureau was in chaos, and they were all sending out information like crazy. Sir, we have sounded the alarm, what should we do next? One of the staff members shouted in a hurried voice. Although the alarm has been sounded, with the current speed of the earthquake zone spreading, it will definitely reach New York City in a short time. And because this is a magnitude 8 earthquake, at least 2/3 of the buildings in New York will collapse. What can we do? Immediately notify the hospital to evacuate and be ready to rescue the injured at any time. The officer's face was pale, and his roar echoed in the room. He could only hope that the earthquake would be shorter. Maybe at least this would ensure that more buildings could survive. The reason why the hospital was notified first was that after the earthquake, medical resources were most needed. Although the earthquake was 60 or 70 kilometers away from New York, the aftermath was at least 7 degrees. And if the earthquake expanded further, the consequences would be disastrous. What's more, New York happened to be a coastal city. Once the agitation caused huge waves, the death toll would rise sharply. Okay, I'll arrange it right now. The staff member rolled back to his position and started to notify quickly. There was not much they could do now, and it was good enough to inform as many people as possible. So much so that now he could already imagine how horrible the scene after the disaster was. A violent alarm sounded over New York. Passers-by walking on the street noticed that everyone's mobile phone vibrated at the same time. This made them widen their eyes, and their faces were full of doubts. What's going on? Why did the alarm suddenly sound? Hey, there seems to be a message on my phone. Could something have happened? The alarm sounded so urgent. That shouldn't be possible. What could possibly happen? Quote. They took out their phones with doubts on their faces. When they saw the message on it, fear spread quickly in their hearts. They had never thought that an earthquake would happen. Although the earthquake had not started to spread rapidly, the citizens of New York City had already begun to feel a slight shake. Ah, there's an earthquake, run. I received a text message and it is expected to arrive to our end soon. It's over. This is a magnitude 8 earthquake. There's not even enough time to run away. Even if I ran, there would be no way I could escape with so many tall buildings. Quote. Amid the sound of terrifying alarms, the crowd ran downstairs like crazy. They ran at the fastest speed in their lives at this moment. They had already felt a slight tremor when they received the news. In other words, even if the earthquake has not spread to this side, it has already caused an impact. Not far away on the beach, a fisherman was sitting on an expensive fishing chair, lowering his head and tying the fish hook carelessly. After hooking the bait, he casually threw the hook into the water. As a frequent visitor to the Air Force, he was used to the bait being eaten after he ran down. Just when he was about to pay attention to the float, he suddenly felt the ground began to shake constantly, and his brows frowned slightly. Earthquake. Looking up, the sea water was retreating rapidly. Even the fishing float fell on the reef. What's going on? Looking at the receding sea water, he frowned and lifted his sun hat. But when he saw the scene in the distance, the fishing rod in his hand fell on the reef. With a vibration, he saw that huge waves of dozens of meters began to surge on the sea surface in the distance. When he saw this scene, he stood there dumbfounded. I'm going to die. He didn't even have time to take his expensive equipment, and ran towards the car in a hurry. If such a big wave hit him, he would be dead. At the same time, in the Avengers base. Bang! Tony stood up and slammed the table, looking at Steve angrily. Steve. Sam saw you let Bucky go. He kept walking back and forth in anger, with endless anger in his eyes. He never thought that Steve would let Bucky go. Steve took a deep breath, his chest puffed up high, and looked at Tony firmly. Bucky didn't do it on purpose, he was controlled by someone. He knew very well that Bucky didn't do it on purpose at all, he just fell into someone else's trap. And he had already asked Bucky, he was not at the scene at all. So what? Tony gritted his teeth, is that your reason? So you didn't arrest him? He didn't expect that Steve would do such a thing for his own selfish desires. Calm down. Steve's voice was also a little unhappy. What we need to do is to catch the real culprit behind the scenes, instead of holding Bucky accountable. He didn't want to see his friend being wrongly accused for no reason, and he firmly believed that only by catching the real culprit could the incident be resolved. What's more, the other party's purpose would definitely not be that simple. Ha ha. Tony laughed in anger, supported the table with both hands, and shouted in a low voice, then how are we going to explain to Wakanda and Ross? Regardless of whether the other party is the real murderer or not, what they have to do is to bring him back first and then interrogate him. Instead of doing such excessive things based on their own selfish desires. This has not considered the current position of the Avengers. Now Ross and Wakanda have been putting pressure on them, and he is almost out of breath. They have not considered the future at all, but only considered everything in front of them. We don't work for them, why should we give them an explanation? Steve crossed his arms, panting and looking at Tony in dissatisfaction. They are obviously an independent organization, but they act like they are working for others. Childish. How can you be so childish at your age? Tony had no place to vent the anger that had accumulated in his heart. This was simply because he had not considered the future. It was true that they were an independent organization, but that did not mean that they could completely ignore the authorities. If there were no constraints, would they be able to do whatever they wanted in the future? The other Avengers members were either standing or sitting, watching the two quarreling in silence with complicated expressions. Everyone had different ideas in their minds. Watching them quarreling, they had no way to interrupt. Otherwise, it would become an extremely chaotic quarrel. Wanda sat on a stool in the corner of the office, her eyes becoming more and more impatient. In her opinion, the most important thing now was to find Bucky first. No one could proceed without finding Bucky. Buzz buzz buzz, a crimson light had already swirled around her hands. She was ready to stop the two from quarreling. Suddenly, the whole building began to shake slightly. What's going on? Steve spread his legs slightly to steady himself. He hadn't experienced an earthquake in many years. Boss, a large earthquake has been detected, and the magnetic field is in chaos. The earthquake is spreading toward the ocean. Friday immediately notified everyone in the office of the news. Big earthquake. Tony was stunned, and then he shouted solemnly, "Send me the data about the earthquake." If a big earthquake really happened in New York, the consequences would be disastrous. The next moment, a blue light projection instantly appeared in front of everyone. An 8.0 magnitude earthquake is spreading rapidly towards the ocean. The current location is 4.6 magnitude, and the aftershock in New York City is 3.6 magnitude. Tony's eyes widened when he saw this map data. Because this earthquake was very strange, because it did not spread in all directions, but spread directly towards the ocean. It was as if it deliberately avoided New York, and only some aftershocks that were transmitted farther away arrived. If not, New York would be a ruin now. And this earthquake was too strange, it was completely beyond his cognition. What is going on? There is something wrong with this earthquake. How is it possible that the direction of an earthquake's vibrations can be controlled? And did you notice that it seems to deliberately avoid areas where there are no people? This is so horrible, what on earth is going on? Quote. Everyone's face became extremely solemn. The earthquake that occurred this time can only be defined as the location of the earthquake zone being different. Because of some relationship, the aftermath was only slightly transmitted. And at this moment, the earthquake that was shaking continuously also stopped at this time. The whole process took less than 10 seconds. After feeling the earthquake stop, everyone was still in shock. Because it was simply too terrifying, even if it was just a slight shake. It made people feel the horror of the earthquake. Only Wanda noticed something wrong. That is, the location of this earthquake zone is very familiar, and the location of Hood's house is inside it. Could it be that Hood caused it? But it just flashed through her mind. It shouldn't be possible, after all, this is an earthquake. And from the spread point above, this earthquake spread for 60 or 70 kilometers. This is no longer something that can be controlled by human power. Inside the manor, looking around, except for the villa behind, everything in front of him has undergone extremely terrifying changes. All the land on the ground turned up, and many decorations were directly rolled into the ground. The surrounding trees were tilted to the left and right, and even the ground was ups and downs. It was as if everything in front of it was pulled away from the ground with brute force. Many trees were even directly sucked into the constantly moving cracks. Some decorations and trees were even buried in the soil, with only half of them left. Is this the real power? The girl stared at everything that happened in front of her in a daze, swallowing her saliva unconsciously. She had never thought that she would have such a powerful power. This power was like a natural disaster. In just a few seconds, everything in front of her changed drastically. And this power seemed to be able to destroy the world. She was sure that if the man in front of her wanted to, he could easily destroy an entire city. He could even use this power to make the city disappear completely underground. What's more, it only lasted for a few seconds. She even noticed that when Hood did all this, there was no change on his face. It was as if he had done something insignificant, and he didn't even raise his eyelids too much. This is just the tip of the iceberg of magnetic field control. Hodder waved his hand and spoke calmly. Although he was a little reluctant, he knew that this power must not be used anymore. He specifically controlled the direction of the power output, otherwise the aftermath alone would be enough to make New York City suffer. Although he is not a good person, he has never thought about destroying a city. But it has to be admitted that this power is terrible. If it really erupts at will, he can even control the seawater to swallow up the entire city. This is the power of the magnetic field, so the use of magnetism is only the lowest level of manipulation method. Only Luna doesn't know, after all, the power of steel is limited. But the magnetic field can change a lot of things, and this is the ability Luna needs to learn. This is simply too powerful. The girl was stunned and even stuttered when she spoke. If she could be that powerful, no one would be able to bully her anymore. Moreover, those demons could never be her opponents. She thought she would be like this for the rest of her life, but Hood opened a whole new door for her. Magnetic field control can be used in that way, which completely subverted her three views. Her life was changed at this moment. Hood would never have thought how terrifying the girl would become in the future. So don't underestimate yourself, you are very powerful. Hood rubbed Lorna's hair beside him and gently comforted her. Sometimes, a word from others may change a person's life. Those so-called experimenters, they themselves don't have this power, how can they know the horror of this power? Even defined it as magnetism. This is simply a big joke. So can I be like this in the future? Lorna pulled the corner of Hord's clothes with excitement, her shining eyes widened. When Hord was demonstrating just now, she already understood how to use this power. In other words, she would be able to do this soon. No way. Hod stretched out his index finger and gently waved it in front of Lorna. There was a serious look in his eyes. Lorna's originally excited expression suddenly became depressed. She thought she also had such a powerful force, but she didn't expect that it would not work. It seems that she and Mr. Hood still have a lot of awareness. At this time, Hood continued to say, this kind of power must not be used casually by you. Unless I am here, who will help you mow the lawn? Mowing the lawn. Lorna was stunned at first, and then she understood what Hood meant. It's not that she can't do it, but it's a problem of follow-up. But she looked at the messy scene and pouted. It seems that it will cost a lot of money to repair it. These cracks can't even be seen at a glance. Hood smiled, waved his hand, and a dark red light suddenly emerged. It was like a wave spreading rapidly towards the distance. The cracked ground seemed to be going backwards in time. Everything began to move backwards, and the things that were originally buried underground returned to their original positions. And after the dark red light passed, the cracks slowly healed, and the grass grew again. It was a quiet and peaceful scene, as if nothing had happened. Lorna looked at the man in front of her in shock. This man is not only mysterious, but also extremely powerful. New York, Bronx, in front of Empire State University. A bright black Aston Martin DBX slowly stopped in front of the school gate. The driver's eyes were shattered and his body was sitting straight. As the rear door slowly opened, a woman in a black dress stretched her snow-white legs out of the car. She was wearing a brown windbreaker, carrying a fashionable small leather bag, and wearing a pair of dark black sunglasses. Hela stood outside the gate of Empire State University with a smile on her face and snapped her fingers. The Aston Martin DBX behind him suddenly woke up and looked around with a puzzled look on his face. Finally found it. Hela took off her sunglasses and raised her lips. She had basically been recovering her strength during this period. Now that she had recovered more than half of her strength, she was looking for the breath of the Phoenix Force everywhere. The Midgardians hid their breath so well. After spending many days, she finally caught a trace of the breath of the Phoenix Force here. Familiar Phoenix Force aura. Hela took a step forward and strode towards the inside of the school. When the men around saw her, their eyes were involuntarily drawn to her. This woman had an indescribable aura, as if she could not help but plunge into the abyss. Following the aura, Hela walked into the teaching building, took off her sunglasses and put them in her small leather bag. It should be here. She could clearly feel that this breath was spreading from a classroom upstairs. Although it was extremely weak, she was sure that it was indeed the power of the phoenix. Gwen Stacy. The female professor with round-framed glasses was calling out the names of the people below. Gwen Stacy. The female professor shouted again. Then she saw the girl with short blonde hair raised her hand in a daze. It's time. Gwen, you don't look very energetic. The female professor looked at Gwen. This girl left a deep impression on her. She was very focused in every class. But for some reason, she looked listless today. At the same time, Hela walked out of the classroom with elegant steps. She looked around quickly and soon locked her eyes on Gwen, who had just been called. Gwen, so it came from you. Hela was not surprised when she saw Gwen, because this phoenix force was too little. To be more precise, it was just stained with a little phoenix force. What is certain is that this must have come into contact with the user of phoenix force. However, as long as the relationship between this person and the man that day is known, I am afraid that person will be found soon. Very good. Richard Gerald. The female professor nodded with satisfaction after calling the names of the people behind according to the list above. It seems that there are not many people missing in this class. Just as she turned her head, she noticed a mature woman standing at the front door of the classroom. Are you Miss Sally? She was stunned for a moment, then pushed her glasses and asked. What's wrong? Hela, who was standing outside the door, was looking at Gwen inside. When she heard the female professor's question, she frowned and asked back. I'm waiting for you to come and substitute for me. The previous teacher is sick, so I'm bothering you to come and help substitute for a week. The female professor explained with a helpless tone. She was just here to substitute for me, but the teacher hadn't been here for more than a month due to personal reasons. So she simply invited someone from another school to substitute for me, so she only knew the substitute teacher's name. Substitute for me. Hela hesitated for a moment, and then a bright smile appeared on her lips. Yes, that's right, I'm here to substitute for me. She also wanted to get in touch with this girl named Gwen, and now she had a chance to get in touch with her. So she agreed without thinking. Then I'll ask you to teach these children well. The content has been sorted out now. The female professor's expression became much happier when she heard this. After all, she finally didn't need to come to class. After all, she had her own classes every day. After handing the lesson plan to Hela, the female professor hurried away. Dear students, today I will teach you a good lesson. Hela walked into the classroom in high heels and casually threw the lesson plan on the table. She looked at the group of curious Midgardians in front of her with her thick eyeliner. This teacher is quite good looking. Yes, but the eyeliner is too dark. Could it be that she likes rock music? Who can say for sure? After all, he is just a substitute teacher from another school. But I heard that she has rich teaching experience and has taught many outstanding students. Quote, quote. The students in the classroom have more or less heard of the name Miss Sally. They thought she was an old antique who looked serious, but they never expected her to be such a fashionable woman. Although she has thick eyeliner, from her appearance, she will definitely look better without the eyeliner. This even made the boys present a little excited. After all, this is a big beauty, who doesn't want to have a pleasant love? Lecture. Hela ignored the gazes and whispers below and just flipped open the lesson plan. There was a big line of words written on it. In-depth analysis and path exploration of clean energy technology innovation and industry coordinated development to achieve sustainable energy system. What the hell is this? How could Hela, the goddess of death, understand the lesson plan of the Midgardians? After flipping through a few pages irritably, she threw the lesson plan directly into the trash can. She was in no mood to teach these people, and even if she did, it would be a biological anatomy lesson. Congratulations, you met me. Hela tilted her head back slightly, looking at the students present with contempt. So you can stay in the classroom and review honestly this period. Huh, what's going on? You're not going to give a lecture. I haven't passed this course yet, don't play with me. Shouldn't they tell us something about energy? This is so irresponsible. If you don't have class, just leave. We don't need to study on our own. Quote, quote. The students present were immediately shocked. Imperial State University is a good university after all. So they are much more self-disciplined than other schools. When they heard the news, they were immediately unhappy. Moreover, they paid money to study, not to come here to study. Shut up, everyone. Hela looked at the chaos with disgust. With a roar, the whole classroom suddenly became quiet. An indescribable breath began to linger in this place. When this breath appeared, the students' faces suddenly changed, as if something was pressing on their lungs. The pressure of the goddess of death was madly spreading in the classroom, and everyone looked at Hela with fear. Well, the whole world is quiet. Hela raised her lips and clapped her hands in satisfaction. It turned out that she was still very suitable to be a teacher. Now everyone should shut up. Hello. Just then, a puzzled voice suddenly came from outside the door. Hela turned around and saw a woman who looked to be in her 50s standing outside the door holding a book. She kept looking at the students in the classroom, as if she was thinking about something. Hela understood instantly that this was probably the teacher who was going to come to substitute for the class. A barely perceptible green light flashed in her eyes. Sorry, I'm out of here. Teacher Sally shook her head with a broken look in her eyes, and turned away in a daze after apologizing. Hela found a stool, crossed her legs and looked at the students below. At the same time, her eyes often met with Gwen's. But at this time, Gwen was lying listlessly. She was glad that she didn't have a class today. Because now her mind was full of things about Hood and Wanda. I had no intention of listening to the class. Ding, ding, ding. As the harsh bell rang, noisy footsteps sounded outside. Gwen breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, the class is over. She stood up and was about to go home. However, a figure blocked her way. It was Hela. She raised the corner of her mouth and said, "Gwen, can you take me around the campus?" "Ah, me." Gwen was stunned. This new substitute teacher with a good temperament would actually look for her. Late at night, Hood drove a black Cayenne to the door of a luxury hotel. Today, he wore a black suit for the first time in a long time. After getting out of the car, he handed a US dollar and the car keys to the doorman. Then he took the initiative to walk to the back door, opened the door, and stretched out his right hand to invite the girl in the dark green evening dress out. The girl had her hair tied up, and although she pretended to be very calm, she couldn't help but look at everything happening around her. Today was still he was planning to go find Wanda, but Wanda has been too busy lately. Plus, he has to attend the Stark Group's shareholder banquet tonight. This shareholder banquet is held every quarter, and all shareholders, including Stark Group's partners, are invited. It is an extremely grand banquet. He originally didn't plan to come, but Tony kept calling to urge him. In the end, he agreed, and he also wanted to take this opportunity to invite Lorna to accompany him to the banquet. Ever since he showed his strength in front of Lorna the day before yesterday, Lorna seemed to have some awe of her. Even when talking, her eyes were a little evasive, and she didn't even dare to come over and talk to him. When they saw each other, she just said hello. But she also worked harder in practicing her skills, basically practicing non-stop at home. It was also because she took into account that Lorna had spent the past few years in a cage, so her character was so cautious. She simply brought Lorna to the dinner, and also accompanied her to take a good look at the outside world. The moment Lorna appeared, countless reporters on both sides of the hotel pressed the shutter in their hands. After all, this was a dinner hosted by the Stark Group, and it was a privilege to be able to attend. The people here are all top bosses or great people. It can be said that most of the rich and powerful people in New York can be seen here. As for the wealthy people who came from other places, let alone. No one is willing to give up this opportunity to get in touch with the Stark Group. Anyone who received an invitation would like to know about it to the whole world. At that moment, countless flashes of light lit up, and the dazzling light even made Lorna squint slightly. Even her heartbeat accelerated. She took a deep breath, straightened her chest, and walked inside with Hood. She was afraid of embarrassing Hood beside her. "Sorry, I don't accept interviews." Hood was already familiar with the interviews from reporters. He just shook his head and refused, then tactfully took Lorna to the hotel. "Hey, my man, you finally came." As soon as he entered the hotel, he saw Tony walked up to him with his arms open and gave Hodder a warm hug. This move made Hodder attract a lot of attention for a while. After all, they didn't expect that Tony would be so enthusiastic about an unknown person. "Tony, why do you look so haggard? Hod took Lorna and Tony to the corner and sat down at the round table before asking. After all, Tony looked like he hadn't slept for more than 10 days. His eyes were full of haggardness and fatigue, and his dark circles looked extremely deep. There have been some troublesome things recently. Tony took a glass of brandy from the waiter's plate and drank it all. He was really exhausted during this period. What's going on? Are you interested in telling me about it? Hod was also very curious about what would happen if there was no split. Steve actually protected a criminal for his own selfish desires. Tony gritted his teeth and said with unwillingness in his eyes, "That's right. That's right, a criminal." Whenever he thought of Bucky, he was so angry that his teeth itched, and the recent earthquake gave him a headache. In addition, the earthquake that occurred yesterday was too strange. These things made him almost breathless. Perhaps he has something to hide. Hodder understood the current situation after hearing this simple sentence. Oh, Tony shook his head and sighed, lowering his head and said, "I just feel that it is becoming increasingly difficult for Steve and I to communicate." Hod patted Tony on the shoulder and said in a kind tone, "If you have any difficulties, I can help you at any time." "Thank you for your kindness, man." Faced with Hood's comfort, Tony shook his head, "But you know, the Avengers, affairs are never simple. After all, Hood is just a businessman. Even if he wants to help him, what can he do?" Boom. At this moment, the ceiling suddenly exploded. Countless fragments mixed with steel bars fell from above. Dust and fog spread, and the heat wave generated by the explosion swept across. Ah! The guests at the scene all screamed sharply. Everyone immediately ran to different locations. At this time, the ceiling above their heads actually fell directly towards Hood and Tony. The two were just in the middle. "Get out of the way." Tony reacted and tried to dodge. But without armor, he could only watch the huge bricks fall. Buzz. At this critical moment, a burst of energy flashed, covering the falling wreckage bricks. Tony looked at the scene above his head and widened his eyes. What is floating? Buzz. A low humming sound accompanied by a green light suddenly formed a dark green semicircular barrier. The barrier wrapped up all the fallen stones and boulders and threw them out of the window. This sudden scene made everyone present breathe a sigh of relief. I almost thought I was dead. What is going on and why did it suddenly explode? Could it be a terrorist attack? What saved us just now? After surviving the disaster, everyone's legs went limp and they sat down on the ground. What had just happened was so horrible that they even thought the hotel was going to collapse. Tony gasped for breath, still a little frightened. Just now he even thought that he, the great Iron Man, might die in such a miserable way. However, his eyes shifted to behind him because he just saw a girl with dark green hair bursting out green light from her hands. "Are you okay?" Hod stepped forward quickly and supported the already exhausted Luna with both hands. He had just wanted to attack, but he didn't expect Luna to react so quickly. And Luna should have been far beyond her limit just now. She actually blocked all the boulders and threw them all out at once. "I'm fine." Lorna's face turned pale, her legs softened, and she leaned directly into Hood's arms. Even her voice became extremely weak at this time. After being supported, the green light emanating from her hand dissipated. Tony, Happy suddenly rushed in, and with a large number of security guards, he immediately surrounded Tony in the center. He looked at all the guests present with a serious expression, as if he would shoot at the first sign of trouble. After making sure that Tony was fine, Happy gave the order with a serious look. Group 1, Group 2, go search upstairs and find out what's going on. Group 3 and 4, question and check the guests at the scene. You don't need to look to know that this is definitely a long-planned terrorist attack. It even avoided their previous inspection and installed explosives quietly and silently. At the same time, the police also arrived at the hotel at a rapid speed and set up a cordon. In the hotel lounge, I'm really sorry that something like this happened. Tony, sitting on the sofa, scratched his hair and apologized. Even if he survived, the other guests would definitely cause serious problems. After all, the people present were all top wealthy people, and they were probably scared by this incident. It would be a big problem just to deal with the aftermath. It's okay, as long as no one in 960 is injured. Hodder shook his head and didn't take it to heart. Instead, He walked to the side and poured a glass of warm water and handed it to Lorna, who was leaning on the sofa. Although Lorna is a little exhausted now, the sudden situation just now also greatly improved Lorna's control. Moreover, even without Lorna, these people would not be injured. Tony looked at Lorna at this time and remembered what happened just now. If it weren't for the girl brought by Hodder today, it would probably lead to terrible consequences. He couldn't help but be curious, that is, the ability of this girl. He wanted to ask, but finally dismissed this idea in his mind. Because this is the person brought by Hodder, and he is not in the mood to ask about this matter now. What he cares more about is who is the mastermind behind today. Just thinking of this, he was a little irritable and uneasy. Although Happy has brought security personnel to search now. But there are still not many clues, and he can only further check the surrounding surveillance. See if you can find some clues from it. Thank you. Lorna took the warm water and took a sip. Her mental fatigue had improved a lot. After all, this was just overuse of her ability, and there was no damage to her body. By the way, Tony, who do you think the attacker is? Hod asked without turning his head while taking care of Lorna. Tony became a little silent after hearing this. Although he had some guesses, he was struggling whether to tell Hood about his guesses. Because Hood was not a member of the Avengers. If he said it out loud, Hood might be in danger. Bang! At this moment, the door of the lounge was pushed open. A crimson figure rushed in with an anxious look. When she saw Hood sitting next to a girl safely, she breathed a sigh of relief. Just now, after she heard about what happened to Hood and Tony, she rushed over as soon as possible. Fortunately, nothing happened. Tony. At this moment, other people's voices came from outside the door. Steve and others came in one after another, looking at Tony with worried expressions. No one expected that someone would attack Tony at a banquet where celebrities gathered. This must have caused a great impact. After finding out that Tony was fine, the nervous expressions on their faces relaxed a lot. Hodder, I will give you an explanation for this matter. You can take Lorna back to rest first. Tony saw that the team members had come over, and he raised his head hesitantly and said to Hodder. After all, this was their internal meeting, and it was not appropriate for Hodder to listen in. What's more, there were some things he didn't know whether he should tell Hodder. Hood nodded slowly, and he was in no mood to stay here any longer. In fact, before Wanda rushed in, he had already felt the violent fluctuations in Tony's heart. So Tony should know the truth, but he didn't say it. This matter is obviously not as simple as imagined. What's more, Hood didn't want to get involved in these things. This is the business of the Avengers, and his intuition tells him that this matter is inseparable from the Winter Soldier Bucky. Let's go, Lorna. Hood helped Lorna stand up and slowly walked towards the door. It was only then that Wanda noticed the girl next to Hood. He actually found a good sister for me. Wanda widened her eyes, with mixed expressions in her eyes, and glared at Hood secretly. As if to say, just wait and I'll show you some color later. Hood helped Lorna pass by Wanda, shrugged his shoulders and left 2 words, surprise. Surprise? You call this a surprise? Wanda almost exploded on the spot. 2 are not enough, 3 more, although I know it's because of his good physical fitness, this is a bit too outrageous. But because all the teammates are here, Wanda can only suppress her anger and keep silent. Let me see, who is this woman? Wanda cast her eyes on the woman with dark green hair. But the moment she saw Luna, a strange feeling arose spontaneously, and even her heartbeat slowed down. Another very strange feeling arose in her heart. That is, this woman with dark green hair actually gave her a sense of familiarity. It was as if she had seen her somewhere before. Looking at the back of Hood supporting the woman away, Wanda suddenly turned her head and looked at the team members and said, "Let me take Mr. Hood out." As soon as these words came out, everyone present looked at Wanda strangely. They did not expect Wanda to take the initiative to make this request. "Okay, I'll leave it to you." Tony nodded. After all, the danger had just happened. It would be great if Wanda could escort her friend out. After getting her consent, Wanda trotted out of the lounge. The moment the door of the lounge closed, Tony, who was sitting on the sofa, suddenly became extremely cold and gloomy. He looked at Steve with an angry look. "If you have something to say, just say it." Steve walked to the sofa opposite and sat down, casually placing the shield on the table. When he came in just now, he had already noticed that Tony's eyes were filled with deep hostility and vigilance. He even noticed that Tony had put his hand on his watch. He knew very well that Tony's watch could instantly transform into a weakened version of the armored glove. Steve, don't tell me you don't know anything. Tony looked Steve up and down, as if he would take action immediately if he saw something wrong. In his opinion, this matter had nothing to do with Steve, maybe. Steve knew about this, but he just didn't tell him. Because of these things, his mental state has been getting worse and worse recently, and he even feels that everyone is hostile to him. What do I know? Steve gritted his teeth and glared. Do you think I planned this bombing? How could he not understand what Tony meant? But he had no idea what was going on. And what good would it do him to kill Tony? Tony, you think everyone is the murderer, we're all teammates. Sam frowned and retorted subconsciously. He believed in Steve's character very much. Maybe he would do some wrong things. But he would never attack his companions. Not to mention taking the lives of his companions. Tony looked at everyone quietly, and after a long time he said, "This bombing was planned by Bucky." When Tony said this, everyone present was stunned. No one thought that Tony would come to such a conclusion. And they finally understood why Tony was so wary of Steve. Because it was Steve who took the initiative to let Bucky go last time. Tony, do you have any evidence when you say this? Steve said with a gloomy face. In his opinion, Bucky would never do such a thing. And it was clear that they had not investigated the situation clearly, so how could they put the blame on Bucky? He certainly didn't want to see his friend being framed like this. Haha, evidence. If you want evidence, I'll give it to you. Tony sneered, took out a small piece of black substance from the briefcase and threw it on the table. What is this? Steve frowned as he watched Tony throw this thing. This is the explosive material that Happy found upstairs just now, and it is the same material used to kill the king of Wakanda. Tony spoke word by word, his voice filled with indifference. He is very familiar with these materials, and he can determine the composition even without testing. And only this kind of explosive will produce a special charred black substance. Everyone present looked at the substance on the table, and their faces showed disbelief. Because no one thought that this was actually the same batch of materials. This is impossible. Steve stood up suddenly and said excitedly, Bucky is not in the United States at all. He has no way to enter the country. He knew very well that Bucky was definitely not here now, and he had no time or motive to commit the crime. This was clearly a slander to his good friend. Haha, I didn't expect our captain to still want to protect the enemy. Tony leaned on the sofa and looked at Captain America in front of him with indifference. If Captain America continues to be stubborn, don't blame him for being cruel. You are simply putting all the blame on others. Steve picked up the shield and walked quickly towards the door. He felt that he had no way to communicate with Tony. Tony now regarded him as an enemy. There was no way to communicate in this situation. After saying that, he slammed the door and left, without any intention of continuing to talk to Tony. As for the others, they watched all this happen helplessly. I will investigate this matter myself. Tony's eyes were filled with indifference and he showed no sign of regret for Steve's departure. Natasha sat on a stool not far away, watching everything happen with a helpless look on her face. She never thought that things would turn out like this. Hod had just opened the back door and was about to help Lorna into the back seat. At this moment, a crimson figure appeared beside him. Wanda pushed Hod directly into the back seat, her teeth clenching in anger. Lorna, who was standing by, was at a loss for what to do when she saw this sudden scene. She could only stare blankly at the two of them. This is the surprise you mentioned. Wanda pointed at Luna beside her angrily and growled in a low voice. She really didn't expect that this so-called surprise was actually a girl. Yeah, Huoda was stunned for a moment, then nodded with a wicked smile. Why? Don't you like it? Big pig's hoof. Are you really hungry all day long? Wanda pinched his waist hard, her eyes red with anger. How could she like it? It was hard to accept sharing with two people. Now there is another one. She dare not imagine how many women Hood would have. Okay, stop it. After Hood pulled Wanda closer, he shouted to Lorna who was standing outside the door, come in together. Lorna looked at Wanda hesitantly, gritted her teeth and slowly moved up, but the expression on her face became particularly restrained. Although she said she didn't know what was going on, she could see that Wanda and Hood had a very close relationship. Looking at Lorna beside her, Wanda was even more angry. Are you a beast? This girl doesn't look fully developed. After all, judging from her figure, she is extremely thin, not to mention that flat chest. Lorna looked down at herself in confusion and touched her body. Hood patted Wanda's head. You are too dirty, what are you thinking about? I am dirty. It's obviously you. Wanda was even more angry. It was obviously Hood who couldn't control himself. Don't you feel that you are very familiar with her? Hodder approached Wanda, kissed her on the forehead and then said, because she is your sister. When Hodder said this, Wanda's head buzzed and she was stunned. My sister. She had never thought that she actually had a sister. Lorna beside her widened her eyes, not knowing what was going on. If you don't believe me, you can try using chaos magic. Hod spread his hands, shrugged his shoulders and looked indifferent. Wanda raised her hand doubtfully, and when the scarlet light appeared, that extremely familiar and close feeling came. Even Lorna on the side widened her eyes. She never thought that she would find her relatives at this time. Right. Hodder raised the corner of his mouth, hugged Wanda closer and said, tell me, how are you going to repay me? My sister is still here. Wanda blushed and didn't know what to do. Hood's mouth curled up. Isn't this even more exciting? Chapter 71. But Hood let Wanda go temporarily, because the witch still had a mission to complete. The next day, on the weekend, Hood dragged his slippers and walked downstairs. There was still a little sleepiness in his eyes, and even his steps were a little shaky. For him, this lazy time was the most comfortable day. As soon as he walked downstairs, he saw Lorna wearing cute pajamas and carrying breakfast. Why are you making breakfast today? Huoda was stunned for a moment. Normally, it was Imelda who made breakfast. I want to make breakfast for you. Lorna blushed and stammered, thank you for bringing me back and helping me find my sister. You're welcome. I'll try Lorna's cooking. Hod pulled out a chair and sat on it, but when his eyes focused on breakfast, the smile on his face became a little frozen. The sandwich on this plate, well, the sandwich was slightly burnt. Even the egg in the middle looked a little wrong. To be precise, it looked a bit like carbon. And what was sprinkled on it was actually salt, right? Because the slightly burnt appearance clearly showed that it had been sprayed with a spray gun. It should have been sugar. What's wrong? Did I do a bad job? Lorna looked at Hord in front of her with a worried expression. It's okay, I just feel so touched that you can make me breakfast. Hodder's eyes were slightly red, he hadn't felt so bad for a long time. What kind of devilish food is this? If he didn't know that this was well-intentioned, he would have suspected that Lorna wanted to inherit his family property. He took a deep breath, picked up the sandwich and stuffed it into his mouth, and the sour, sweet, bitter, spicy and salty taste suddenly jumped on his taste buds. But facing Lorna's sparkling eyes, he still swallowed it. Mr. Hood, don't worry, if you like, I can make it for you anytime. Lorna lowered her head and whispered like a fly. Seeing Hood finish the breakfast she made, she was still very happy. No. Hod stood up seriously and looked at Lorna in front of him with a serious expression. What's wrong? Lorna looked at Hood nervously and asked hesitantly. Could it be that the food she made was too unpalatable? Or did Mr. Hood feel sorry for her? Imelda is our maid. If you do her job, she will be laid off. Hod stared at Lorna and said, do you want her to be laid off? He didn't want to have his tongue destroyed every day. So that's the case, then I don't want to. Thinking of Imelda's amiable elder sister, Lorna still shook her head. It seems that this can only be forgotten. She doesn't want Imelda to be fired because of her. Buzz. Hod felt a vibration in his pocket, and took out his mobile phone to see that it was a message from Gwen. And the content inside was actually Gwen took the initiative to invite him to go out and play. This little girl, what's going on? Hood was stunned. He wanted to find Gwen today to explain it clearly, but he didn't expect Gwen to take the initiative to send him a message to make an appointment. In the suburbs, looking around, the golden maple trees were blown by the breeze, and the golden leaves were blown down to the grass. When the breeze blew, everything seemed so quiet and peaceful. Hood looked at the location on his phone and couldn't help but sigh secretly. I didn't expect that little Gwen actually has a hobby of autumn outing. Because this was Gwen and he had made an appointment to come here for an autumn outing. According to the location above, he quickly came to a place where there was basically no one. As soon as he came here, he saw the figure in a pure white hoodie. Grid. He just raised his hand to greet, and the smile on his face suddenly became extremely gloomy. Because he saw a tall figure that was not very pleasing, and the tall figure was grinning with his head tilted. This was the goddess of death Hela, who had disappeared for many days. He never thought that this guy would appear here, and he came here with Gwen. A strong murderous aura permeated around him. Although he didn't know what was going on, if he dared to hurt Gwen, he didn't mind letting the goddess of death Hela know what true death was. Hod. Gwen saw Hod not far away and trotted over to Hod. Are you okay? Huoda took a deep breath and asked in a low voice. Hello. At this moment, Hela slowly walked in front of Hod, with a meaningful look in her eyes. One could even feel the energy in her body fluctuating. By the way, Hodder, this is my substitute teacher, Ms. Sally. Gwen hurried to Hela's side and introduced Hela to Hodder. Miss Sally. Hodder sneered at Hela and said word by word, when did the great Hela change her name? If this guy could be a substitute teacher, the hyenas would not attack the key parts. And he didn't think this guy had any good intentions. Don't be so nervous, I won't do anything to a child. Hela raised the corners of her mouth with a fake smile, spread her hands, and even made a gesture of invitation, with an extremely calm expression on her face. So what do you want to do? Hod pulled Gwen behind him and looked at Hela warily. Although he was very powerful, he was worried that the other party would attack Gwen. He was not sure whether the other party had any special means. What do I want to do? Don't you know it very well? Hela looked up at the blue sky, opened her hands, and spoke word by word with an obsessed expression. Of course I want to invite you to join me and conquer the universe with me. As long as the Phoenix Force joins, her conquest of the universe will be just around the corner. What's more, in her opinion, this kind of place is just restricting Hood's future. It is a waste of time to hide on this earth with such a strong force. Women, money, power, she can give them to Hood, and Hood can even control countless civilizations. This is much more tempting than a small earth. I am not interested in your plan. Hod frowned and looked at Hela, snorted coldly and said, not to mention, you can't even beat a Midgardian, and you still want to conquer the universe. What's more, if he really wanted to conquer the universe, he didn't need Hela's help at all. He has the system, which is equivalent to the most terrifying power in the world. Moreover, unless he is full and his brain is damaged, he will choose to join a mentally perverted crazy woman. This is not to conquer the universe or to conquer the world. He even suspects that this woman is locked up and crazy. Midgardian, I just broke out of that cage last time. Besides, my strength had not recovered before. If it was now, it would not be a problem to deal with you. Hela said calmly. Although she was beaten badly last time, it was only because she had not recovered enough strength. Although the man in front of her had the power of the Phoenix, this Midgardian definitely had no good way to control it. And she happened to have a way to control the power of the Phoenix, so this time Hood would definitely not be her opponent. What's more, she also planned to teach Hood a lesson and know who was worthy of loyalty. Do you want to be beaten again? Hodder sighed helplessly. This really made her happy, didn't she? She came all the way here just to have some fun. This was simply outrageous. However, this mysterious confidence also gave him a headache. Although he had a way to suppress Hela, he didn't want to waste so much time. He had always been a person who was afraid of trouble. How can you know if you don't try? Hela put her hands on the back of her head and moved them forward. The hair on her head was piled up, forming a helmet like a spike. The clothes on her body also turned into tight combat uniforms. The corners of her mouth were raised, and her eyes became a little excited. I don't have that much time to waste with you, why don't we make a bet? Hodder shook his head. If he gets his way, what will he do if he keeps looking for him? And who knows if this guy will attack the people around him? In that case, it would be better to think of a way to end it all. At least he doesn't have to worry about him looking for him later. Bet. Hela was stunned, then burst into laughter. Ha ha ha, interesting Midgardian, in that case, why don't you tell me what the bet is? She felt that the man in front of her was really interesting. This was the first time she heard someone want to bet with her. I will hit you 3 times. If you can hurt me, I will go with you to conquer that universe. Hod expressed his thoughts. After all, there is no point in beating Hela. He doesn't want to see Hela's sick appearance. Okay, Hela nodded without hesitation. This was a piece of cake for her. Hod said as a rune formed in his left hand, this is a loyalty contract. If you lose, you have to help me. After hearing this condition, Hela, who was originally smiling brightly, froze her smile on her face. She was the goddess of death, but she had to help others. If you don't dare, forget it. Hod spread his hands and looked at Hela with disdain. Hela, who was still hesitating, gritted her teeth and nodded after hearing this, okay. This was a sure win. She didn't believe that Horde could block her attack. Even Odin didn't dare to stand still and withstand her 3 attacks. Gwen, who was listening to the conversation between the two, gradually turned pale. Even if she was stupid, she could tell that this person was not a substitute teacher at all. He was Horde's enemy. I'm sorry. Gwen looked at Hood with regret and apologized. She really didn't expect this to happen. It's okay, she just wanted to stretch my muscles and relieve my boredom. Hod smiled and rubbed her little head to comfort her. It's just a death goddess Hela. Let's go to a quieter place. Hodder took the lead and walked towards a place not far away. After all, it was still possible for others to see us. Come on. After asking Gwen to stay away, Hood stretched his body and made a provocative smile. The dark red phoenix force also spun and solidified outside his body, forming a barrier to block Hood in the middle. I hope I won't kill you. Hela's eyes flashed with murderous intent. Although Hod was nothing in her eyes, she was still very clear about the principle of a lion fighting a rabbit. What's more, the strength of the boy in front of her was not weak at all. Ha! With a roar, she raised her hands like eagle claws, and dark green energy spread in her hands. Crack, crack, crack. The mountain range next to her actually made a terrifying explosion, as if some monster was about to surge out of the ground. Then, the huge mountain range began to crack rapidly, and the entire mountain range was actually lifted up by Hela. The mountain range hovering in the sky was like an extremely terrifying rock dragon, smashing towards Hod fiercely. At the same time, the people in the camp also noticed this extremely terrifying scene. There's a monster. The mountain is flying in the sky. Run. What the hell is going on? Stop packing your things, staying alive is more important. Quote, quote. Everyone wailed and ran away. This horrific scene made them tremble with fear even though they were far away. Hodder, Gwen, who was far away, saw this scene and her heart was lifted. She regretted why she brought this person here. And this strength was so terrifying. It could even lift a mountain. But at this time, Hodder just put his hands in his pockets and looked at the mountain that was falling towards him calmly. As the mountain was about to fall, Hodder just stood there motionless. Rumble. The next moment, this mountain directly buried Hodder with extremely terrifying power. Ha! Hela let out a long breath. It took a lot of effort for her to mobilize such a large mountain range. She guessed that the boy had been buried in the soil and couldn't struggle. Crack! At this moment, a crack suddenly appeared in the mountain range. Then a dark red energy surged out, and the mountain range was actually split apart. Hood put his hands in his pockets with a smile on his face. No way, this is not enough for me to relax my muscles. Gwen breathed a sigh of relief when she saw Hood come out safely. You just want to die. Hela never thought that Hod could block it so calmly. She stretched out 2 sharp blades with her hands, and then the green energy continued to condense between her blades. The more concentrated it was, the more terrifying the power was. Compared with the previous one, it was not at the same level at all. This was a move she would never use normally, because the charging time was too long. She suddenly gathered her hands forward, and the green energy rushed forward like a sword blade. This clearly concentrated all the power on one point. Whoosh! With a loud bang, that point hit the barrier formed by the power of the phoenix fiercely. The surrounding woods were torn apart by this huge force. But after the collision, there was no change at all. How is this possible? Hela's eyes widened, filled with disbelief. You forced me to do this. A trace of death flashed across Hela's eyes. The sky and earth suddenly darkened. Black air burst out from the ground, turning this place into hell. Black ghosts crawled out of the black air. They were the dead souls underground. What is that? Gwen felt a chill down his spine. A monstrous black gas rose to the sky and instantly enveloped the entire forest. People fleeing near the woods saw the eerie black gas. Die. Hela was really angry. Hod had humiliated her, the goddess of death. Now, she was going to use what she was best at to make Hod realize the real gap. What a coincidence. I also know your trick. Hod was calm and composed, and snapped his fingers. Suddenly, the ghosts turned around and attacked Hela. Hela was stunned. She was the goddess of death. She was actually attacked by the ghosts she summoned. Looking at the ghosts approaching, Hela retreated in fear. The next second, endless ghosts instantly submerged her. Bang! Until Hood snapped his fingers again. Whoosh! Those ghosts completely dissipated, and Hela was kneeling on the ground, shaking all over, muttering to herself, impossible. Dada! Hod stepped forward and gathered his loyalty mark. Do you want me to do it, or do it yourself? Hela gritted her teeth and said, it will take me a long time to do it myself. Wanda. Asgard, the realm of the gods. Asgard, the land of the gods. Father, why did you call me here? A man with a beard, light golden hair and armor strode in. His every move revealed an extremely rough temperament, and even when he spoke, there was a faint echo in the whole hall. He was originally planning to attack the fire giant, but who would have thought that he would be called back by his father halfway? Thor, I have something for you to do. The man on the throne was the god King Odin. His expression was extremely serious and majestic, and his voice was full of doubt. It could be seen that Odin's face was a little ugly at this time. Father, just say it, I'll take care of it. Thor patted his chest, and his steel armor banged. Even his expression was extremely flamboyant, and his tone was full of confidence. However, he couldn't help but wonder why his father didn't even have time for him to deal with the fire giant. He just called him back. In fact, you have always had a sister who was sealed in Norway in Midgard many years ago. When Odin said this, a complex emotion flashed in his slightly cloudy eyes. He had mixed feelings about his daughter. I have a sister. Thor was stunned, and suddenly felt like he was struck by lightning. He never thought that he would have a sister. And Odin had never told him. More importantly, this sister was sealed in Midgard. You know, this could only be an order from Odin. But he couldn't understand why his father would be so cruel to seal his sister. Yes, Odin nodded slowly, and then said, she made a big mistake, so she was sealed up. She should have continued to be sealed, but she escaped early. He knew Hela's character very well. If Hela was released, there would definitely be a bloody storm. So before that, he had to find a way to solve this matter, otherwise Hela would definitely cause a huge disaster. So you're going to let me? Thor looked puzzled, although he wanted to know the reason. But seeing Odin's dull expression, he finally didn't ask. If his father wanted to tell him, he would have already told him. I hope you can find Hela's whereabouts. Odin took a deep breath and said his plan in a serious voice. Hela must not be allowed to stay outside. Among so many people, the most suitable candidate is Thor. Although his strength is not as strong as Hela, it should not be too difficult to escape compared to finding her whereabouts. Okay, leave this to me. Thor agreed casually. He just wanted to bring back his sister whom he had never met. This was not a problem for him at all. Moreover, he was also very curious about this so-called sister. What did she do to be sealed in Midgard by her father? Wait, just as Thor was about to turn around and leave, Odin's voice came from behind him. Thor looked back at his father with a puzzled look on his face. You must be careful when you go there this time, because Hela's power is very strong. Even if you find her, don't do it yourself, but inform me immediately. Odin said solemnly. Thor is a reckless guy. If he really fights Hela, he will never be Hela's opponent. So he can only do it himself and seal Hela again. Okay, father. Thor nodded nonchalantly, then walked out of the door. He didn't take Odin's words to heart at all. Although she was his sister, no matter how strong she was, how strong could she be? He was Thor, the god of thunder. There were simply not many people who could be his opponents. After watching the reckless figure leave, Odin, who was sitting on the throne, lowered his head and sighed, clearly looking like he was worried. Because this matter was definitely not that simple, he knew very well that Hela could never break the seal by herself. Although the seal was not stable recently because of his own power, it was absolutely impossible for him to escape. But at this moment, a burst of energy appeared, and this energy directly caused Hela to break the seal and escape. He really couldn't figure out who this power was. And whether this person had his own plans. All this gave him a headache. After all, he didn't know when such a being appeared in Midgard. Everything seemed so confusing. He just hoped that there would be no accidents when Hela was arrested this time. Earth, in the suburbs of New York. Looking around, everything around was devastated. Not only were the surrounding trees like they were blown by a level 15 typhoon, but there were fallen trees everywhere. Even the originally green grass was gone, and all that was left was a stretch of sand like the Gobi Desert. What's even more terrifying is that the original mountain disappeared without any warning, and this mountain range actually moved directly to another location. It was like it was lifted up and put back in this position. It was simply a miracle. A large number of police surrounded this place, and even set up a cordon several kilometers long. Even most of the police in New York were dispatched here. Oh my God, what on earth happened? The Black Widow Natasha looked around, her mouth was wide open in shock. Let alone anything else, this mountain alone was enough to make her scalp numb. Although she had seen the mysterious man take action before, this was no less than what she had seen before. Even this visual sensation was even more terrifying, and she simply couldn't understand how this was done. Even if the largest mining trucks in the Stark group were driven over, it would take more than a day to move the mountain. Not long ago, they received a notice that a huge explosion had occurred here. And some people said that they saw the mountain flying up, and they thought they had seen it wrong. But they didn't expect to see such an outrageous picture after coming here. This is not just as simple as a big explosion. The Winter Soldier incident was annoying enough, and weird things like this often happen in New York. War Machine Rhodes didn't know where to start complaining when looking at the scene in front of him. Not to mention that the relationship between Tony and Steve has become increasingly tense recently, and they are always on edge every time they meet. And weird things happen frequently in New York, with chaotic magnetic fields and energy explosions. Those who don't know would think it's the end of the world, and these crappy things happen near New York. He has to investigate these things every few days, but he hasn't been able to find out anything. The situation here seems. Natasha seemed to notice something from the corner of her eyes. She squatted down and carefully examined the traces on the ground, frowning slightly. There was a little black powder on the ground, but the powder was too fine. If you didn't look closely, you would think it was someone's ground black rock. From the fine touch, it seemed that it had been crushed to the point where the sand and gravel could not be seen clearly. The more she looked at it, the more she felt like she had seen it before. Where is it? I must have seen these things before. Natasha gritted her teeth and recalled quickly in her mind. At this moment, her eyes suddenly widened, and a place came to her mind. That is Gualan Beach. Is this the masterpiece of that mysterious man? Or, are the recent frequent strange things the masterpieces of the mysterious man? How about it? Is there anything wrong with these things? Rode, who was standing by, also noticed that Natasha's face was solemn. It seemed that she had discovered something extraordinary. I think these things are very likely. Natasha was just about to speak out her guess. Boom! Suddenly, a huge rainbow pillar fell from the sky. The dazzling light pillar made everyone present squint their eyes. Then, this person slowly walked out of the dazzling light pillar. Judging from the slightly bloated body, isn't this Thor? Natasha and Rhodes were surprised to see Thor. This guy didn't stay in Asgard, but came to Earth. Long time no see, everyone. Opened his arms and gave Rhodes a hug. His every move was extremely heroic. Why are you here? Natasha asked in a puzzled tone. After all, Thor would never show up here if there was nothing going on. Oh, stop talking, my sister Hela is missing. Thor didn't hide it, but spread his hands and looked at the two with a helpless look. Lost. Natasha and Rodon felt that something was wrong. Last time, the lost Loki almost destroyed the whole New York. Now that a sister is lost, will New York be destroyed directly? These Asgardians are not a group of easy to understand people. After thinking about this, the two of them had a headache. I don't know how to say it, but I think it's correct to say, lost. Thor shrugged his shoulders and answered casually. He didn't think that his so-called sister could cause much trouble. So where are you now? Rode asked with a puzzled look on his face. If you really came to look for your sister, why would you be here? I felt Hela's aura appear here last, so I just came over through the Rainbow Bridge. After all, this kind of energy is so huge that it is absolutely impossible not to notice it. Wait, you said your sister's aura disappeared here. Natasha looked surprised. You know, she found evidence of the mysterious man's appearance here. Yes, judging from the surrounding situation, it should be my sister who did it. Thor looked around and sighed helplessly. This was indeed a big deal, but you can rest assured that we in the divine realm will be responsible for everything here. This is no longer a question of responsibility. Natasha felt a little dizzy for a moment. The earth was already in a mess. Now, things have not been resolved yet, and the matter of the god's domain has been involved. What's more terrible is that the mysterious man seems to have had a fight with Thor's sister. Judging from this anti-human scene, it is estimated that the fight is not small. Buzz. Rhodes' Bluetooth headset suddenly flashed. When the call was connected, his expression instantly became extremely solemn. What happened? Natasha saw Rhodes' expression and felt bad. Don't tell her that things here haven't been dealt with yet. What's the trouble? Steve took Sam and a few others to Germany. Rod gritted his teeth and hung up the phone. He had no idea what was going on. And he estimated that it was most likely related to Bucky the Winter Soldier. How is Tony now? Natasha could guess without thinking. She estimated that Tony would be furious when he heard the news. Tony is going to chase him now. Rode let out a long breath. His face looked extremely ugly. Tony's mood has been very unstable recently, and after seeing this scene, who knows what he will do. Tony must be furious. Natasha shook her head helplessly. I just hope there won't be any unnecessary conflicts. Recently, the tension between them has become increasingly intense. If a fight really breaks out, the consequences will be unimaginable. What are you talking about? What's wrong? What happened? Thor stroked his beard and looked at everything his sister did. After noticing the solemn expressions of the two, he walked over carelessly. There is no time to explain now. Rod shook his head and said that he had to go back first. That's fine, let's talk on the way. Thor didn't care and quickly caught up with the two of them. On the plane. What, does that mean you guys are breaking up now? Thor jumped up suddenly, shaking the cabin. He looked at Tony in disbelief, his eyes full of surprise. Thor, breaking up is used to describe the relationship between men and women. Rod looked at Thor as if he was looking at an idiot. When he started to explain, he couldn't help but shake his head slightly. Oh, Thor twitched his mouth, then said awkwardly, actually, it's almost the same. Shut up, Tony suddenly shouted at Thor, who was chattering non-stop. He was in a very irritable mood. He never thought that Steve would run away with his men. Tony, where are we going now? Thor scratched the back of his head, not paying attention to Tony's tone at all. 0.9 inches just now. Ross gave the order to finally capture the Winter Soldier, but Steve actually wanted to abscond with the Winter Soldier. Tony gritted his teeth, and his voice seemed to be squeezed out from between his teeth. Even when he spoke, he was trembling with anger. He really didn't expect that this guy would be so bold. For one person, he would even do this. Tony, we can't solve the problem with violence, right? Natasha frowned and spoke slowly with hesitation. She didn't want to see her former comrades suddenly fighting each other. She couldn't accept such a thing. What's more, it's not just Steve this time. Sam, Ant-Man, Hawkeye and others. Once the fight starts, it will definitely not be so easy to stop. She would rather see everyone sit down and discuss the problem properly. Natasha. Tony turned his head suddenly, looked at Natasha angrily and spoke word by word. Whose side are you on? He paused and walked to the corner. There sat a noble black-skinned young man. Tony said, "This is T'Challa, the Black Panther. Everyone, I am here to avenge my father." Black Panther T'Challa's eyes were full of anger. Bucky used a bomb to kill my father, he loved peace so much. Hearing this, the cabin fell into chaos. No one spoke, but they looked a little embarrassed. Even Thor, who who was always carefree, fell silent. Wanda, who was sitting in the corner of the cabin, said nothing, just watching the scene. Her face was already filled with grief. Both sides were friends, and she had no way to take sides. No one wanted to help, but she couldn't stay out of it. After hesitating for a long time, a mobile phone appeared in her hand. Wanda. Hood, I'm in trouble, I hope you can help me. Call. Inside the manor, a figure was lying on a recliner in the yard. It was autumn, and the air was a little chilly. The dazzling sunlight shone on the man, warming him up. This is life. Hodder picked up the red wine beside him and took a sip. There was a pack of cigarettes on the table next to him. Buzz. Who sent me a message? Hodder was a little confused when he heard the vibration from his phone. In fact, not many people knew his phone number, and no one would send him text messages. After picking up the phone, he saw the message from Wanda. Wanda. Hood, I'm in trouble, I hope you can help me. Tony and Steve are having a conflict, they might even fight, only you can stop them. Is this coming? Hod recalled the scene in Avengers 3. There were two teams fighting each other, and in the end, if Natasha hadn't rebelled, it is estimated that things would not have turned out so badly. Although Wanda would try to stop it, with Tony's current personality, no one could stop him. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but have a headache. Forget it, since the little witch has asked me to do it, I'll go. After all, this is the first time Wanda has asked him to handle something. He can't just ignore it. Hela. Hodder got up and walked into the house, putting on his clothes. What's going on? Hela stood at the gate with an ugly look on her face. After hearing the voice, she turned back and answered. Since she came back, she has been sent by Hod to guard the gate. She has been standing here all day. It would be a lie to say that she is not aggrieved. When has she, the goddess of death, ever suffered such a punishment? But she has no choice. After all, she has been branded with the mark of loyalty. Come with me later. Hod still planned to take Hela with him. After all, this new subordinate couldn't always be here to guard the door. What's more, Hela was extremely powerful, so it would be nice to take her over to handle these chores. Okay. When Hela heard this, a smile immediately rose on her lips. She finally didn't have to guard the door, so how could she not be happy to be able to go out? Mr. Hodder, can I go out with you? Hearing the voice, Lorna ran downstairs in her slippers. Although she wanted to go out, she didn't want to go out alone. Now that she heard that Hodder was going out, she naturally wanted to go with him. This time I am going out to deal with some serious matters, you should stay at home and look after the house. Hod rubbed Lorna's dark green hair and spoke with a helpless tone. Although he could indeed protect Lorna, this trip was not for fun. It would be better for Lorna to stay at home. All right. Although Lorna was reluctant, she could only nod and agree. At the same time, in the German airport, a large off-road vehicle was driving fast in the airport. Steve drove the off-road vehicle with a serious expression and said nothing. Falcon Sam in the co-pilot turned his head and looked at Steve, with a mixed look in his eyes. He knew exactly what was going on, and with Tony's temper, he knew what would happen without thinking. Your arm is so cool, where did you buy it? I want to buy one for myself in the future, right? But I think maybe I can get an identical metal arm tonight. By the way, does your metal arm have any other functions? A young man in the back seat looked at Bucky's metal arm and kept muttering. Bucky, who was sitting in the right rear seat, was annoyed by the incessant chatter and turned to look at the young man. Shut up. Scott, you are Ant-Man, not Sparrow. He couldn't understand why he had been talking non-stop since he got in the car. It was as if he had endless topics to talk about. Even if he didn't pay much attention to him, he still didn't stop. If he continued to listen to Scott's chatter, he would probably go crazy. Hey. Scott raised his hand and kept saying soothingly, don't be so irritable, and be more respectful, okay? He just wanted to know how the metal arm was obtained. Why did he suddenly get angry? I can show respect, but you have to sew your mouth shut first. Bucky gritted his teeth and looked at Ant-Man with a heavy breath. For the first time, he regretted why he didn't bring earplugs with him. This guy's words gave him a headache. And this was an emergency, who knew what would happen next? In this situation, This guy actually still had the mind to chat. There's no way to sew my mouth shut. Scott shook his head and looked at Bucky seriously. Just as he was about to continue talking, Steve in the driver's seat finally spoke. Okay, both of you be quiet. Steve's attention was now focused on the surroundings. He didn't think that Tony would give up so easily. And the other party must have rushed over here. He just hoped to take Bucky to the destination as soon as possible. As long as he could find the mastermind behind the scenes, he could help Bucky clear his name. He didn't want his friend to bear this stigma for the rest of his life. Then, Steve drove the car deep into the airport. On the vast airport runway. Bang! Suddenly, a red figure swooped down, and with a loud bang, it blocked the front of the car. This was a golden red mecha. As the head storage opened, the appearance of the person inside was revealed. And the person blocking the car was Tony Stark. At the same time, several other figures walked out on both sides. Black Panther T'Challa walked out first. Hawkeye Barton also came to Tony's side. War Machine Rhodes, wearing a mecha, and Vision descended from the sky, looking at Steve and the others with a serious look. Black Widow and Thor came out of the container nearby. The next one was Wanda, who had a weird expression on her face. I didn't expect you guys to come. Steve's eyes flashed with disappointment, but more of determination. He stopped the car, and the others opened the door and got out. He would never watch his friend being taken back like this. Although they all came to stop him, he firmly believed that his decision was absolutely right. Instead of listening to Ross's arrangement, he was more willing to believe in his own choice. The Avengers, who used to be united, split into two groups at this moment. Steve, where did you find this little thug? Tony pointed at Scott with a serious look in his eyes, but said in a teasing tone, this guy seems to have been in jail for several years. He hoped that Steve would honestly hand over Bucky at this time. Then the Avengers could resolve their differences. I'm not some gangster. Scott grinned, stretched his body for a while, and then said, but I have indeed been in prison. Are you two really going to go to this extent? You have an extremely deep friendship. Thor scratched the back of his head, forced a smile and said, I don't think it's necessary to make such a fuss. Although he said he was standing here, he didn't know what to do at this moment. Although he is carefree, it doesn't mean he will listen to one side of the story. In his opinion, it's better to sit down and have a good talk. As for this Bucky, at worst, he can just ask clearly. But no one at the scene responded to his words. He could only awkwardly turn his gaze elsewhere and even whistled as if nothing had happened. Tony, I won't beat around the bush with you, just get out of my way. Steve knew that this was definitely not going to end peacefully. If Tony really wanted to do it, then they would just have to rush forward. Steve, I don't want to see you make the same mistake again and again, so just hand over Bucky. Tony, who originally had a stiff smile, now looked extremely serious. It was because of Bucky that T'Challa lost his father. Now that he has thought it through, there is absolutely no way he will compromise. Mistake after mistake. Have you ever thought that the truth is not so? Steve gritted his teeth and said, I hope you can give me some time. He glanced at Bucky beside him, his eyes full of he was determined. No matter what, he would never let Tony take Bucky away without knowing the truth. And he had already asked Bucky at that time, and he knew that he didn't do these things. Although there were some accidents later, it was because Bucky was controlled. As long as he found Zemo, everything would be revealed. Time, haha, Tony sneered, his eyes gradually became colder. You obviously want Bucky to hide. He was unwilling to believe Steve's lies. Do you really have to do this? Steve clenched the shield in his hand and slightly stepped forward. In this case, he could only grit his teeth and prepare to force his way through. The most urgent task now was to find a way to send the Winter Soldier away. Sam, don't follow Steve and make the same mistake again and again. Tony had no way to persuade him and turned his eyes to Sam, who was next to Steve. He hoped that his fellow Avengers members could stand in his perspective. Their behavior now was tantamount to betrayal. They took Bucky away without any consent. I believe him. Sam didn't know if what he did was right. But he believed that Steve would not make the wrong choice. Hearing this, Tony's eyes became even colder. It was obvious that Steve was wrong, but he still refused to change his mind. He could even let bygones be bygones, and as long as he came back, he could pretend that nothing had happened. Tony, I'm sorry. At this moment, what Tony didn't expect was that Hawkeye Barton actually walked slowly to the opposite side. He stood beside Steve resolutely. I also think your idea is too radical. He wants you to believe that Steve's choice is not wrong, and Bucky may really be wrong. At that time, he also noticed a lot of details, and he finally chose Captain America. Although he didn't know what it would turn out like in the end, he felt that this choice should not be wrong. Patton, you actually. Tony never expected that Barton would suddenly turn against them at this time. It would be fine if he remained neutral, but he didn't expect that he would stand on Captain America's side. This made him, who was already angry, even more furious. He turned around and looked at everyone. Who else wants to quit? I don't want to help any side, I just hope that everyone can have a good talk. Wanda stood aside without hesitation. I don't want to hurt anyone. Although she knew that with her current strength, she could greatly increase the chances of victory for any party. But this is not what she wants, she just hopes that everyone can get together. Thor shrugged and said, I just want to be a spectator. He didn't know the specific situation now, and he would not get involved in this matter casually. The Vision, who had no sense of existence, said solemnly, Tony, I believe you. Black Widow Natasha stood silently behind Tony without speaking, but her expression became particularly complicated. Steve and Tony looked at each other, and the answers of both sides were already expressed in their eyes. The next second, everyone moved instantly and rushed towards each other. Tony and Steve collided with each other instantly, and neither side had the slightest intention of holding back. Let me pass. Steve blocked Tony's punch, and a shield hit Tony's face hard. There was a buzzing sound. Tony did not answer Steve, but stepped forward, and the palm cannon burst out suddenly. At this critical moment, Steve directly took it with his shield. Falcon Sam was circling quickly in the sky, and War Machine Rhodes immediately focused all his attention on him. Because it was the situation of a former comrade in arms, Rhodes did not launch a missile, but bit Sam tightly, intending to pull Sam down from the sky. The two circled rapidly in the air. Although Falcon wanted to fight back, he couldn't even make a difficult U-turn. Hawkeye Barton tacitly chose Black Widow Natasha. After all, the other guys were basically at the level of monsters. Bucky, you go first. Steve gritted his teeth and shouted at Bucky, who was avoiding Vision's attack not far away. If they continued to delay, it would not be a solution. As long as Bucky left, there would be no need to continue fighting. Bucky gritted his teeth and ran away quickly. At this moment, a man in a black jumpsuit suddenly kicked him out. This man was the Black Panther T'Challa. At the same time, the scene was already in chaos. Steve was about to rush over to help Bucky, but Vision on the side immediately transferred the attack to him. Ant-Man also stared at Iron Man at this time. Although the hero had unplugged some wires, he was directly driven out by the fire extinguishing system. Wanda, who was not far away, watched this scene, but could not make a move at will. When she saw the moment when Black Panther was about to kill Bucky, she could only grit her teeth and use chaos magic to throw Black Panther away. War Machine Rhodes had already noticed Bucky, who was defenseless at this time, and when he was about to go over, his expression suddenly became extremely ugly. He looked back and saw that Ant-Man had grown so fast that he even dragged his right leg. This scene shocked everyone. They couldn't help but stop what they were doing and stared at the scene in front of them in a daze. This is really good. It can even get bigger. Thor, who was watching the show not far away, widened his eyes when he saw this scene. For a moment, he was even a little eager to move. Just when everyone was stunned, Steve and Bucky exchanged glances and ran quickly towards the airport. But Tony flew straight at a low altitude and threw Steve to the ground. The two of them kept fighting with punches and kicks. But neither side could do anything to the other. Bang! At this critical moment, the two short blades drew a beautiful arc in the air and stabbed into the ground fiercely. A terrifying green energy burst out. With a buzzing sound, everyone was shocked by this energy. Stop it, everyone. A noble and elegant woman in black slowly walked out. Her voice was calm, but it rang in everyone's ears. This terrifying pressure made everyone stop what they were doing. This voice made everyone feel afraid. Everyone focused their attention on this figure. The goddess of death Hela came over. Hela. Thor, who was originally watching the show, stopped smiling the moment he saw this figure appear. He never expected that Hela would appear here. Feeling the pressure, his original contempt also disappeared at this moment. He could clearly feel how powerful his sister, the goddess of death, was. Steve and Tony, who were fighting on the ground, had their hairs on their backs when they saw Hela appear. They stopped their hands at the same time and looked at Hela, the goddess of death, with a serious look. Although they have torn their faces now, when they encounter an external crisis, they will still be united against the outside world at the same time. Even the Black Panther, who hated his father's murderer, did not continue to chase Bucky, but kept his eyes on Hela like everyone else. Under the oppression of this fear of death, they all knew that this was not the time to continue the civil war. They all slowly stood together and confronted Hela, the goddess of death. Even Wanda's eyes were more fearful, because she knew very well that this person was definitely not a simple person. Hela, the god's domain can't control the earth now. Tony stood not far away, gritting his teeth and staring at Hela. He didn't think his sister was here just to watch the show. And he didn't forget the order Odin gave him. It's just that he didn't expect to meet here. Now that she's here for no reason, it's not a good thing. Ha, do you think I want to care? Hela raised a disdainful smile and turned to look at the tall tower behind her. If it weren't for him, I wouldn't bother with your shit. She didn't have any interest in these Midgardians at all. In her opinion, the strength of these people was just that. As for her brother Thor, she never took him seriously. When Hela turned around, everyone subconsciously followed her gaze. I saw a figure standing on the tall tower in the distance, and a faint black mist was floating on his face like a black flame. The moment they saw it, they immediately felt an extremely terrifying sense of oppression. This is not only from the physical, but also from the mental. Although he stood there without any movement, the casual figure made everyone a little breathless for a while. Although it was just a glance, everyone recognized his identity. This is the guy on the orchard beach. Tony's voice became extremely solemn, even though his face was covered with an indescribable black mist. But the terrifying sense of oppression made them very clear that this man was definitely the mysterious man. Moreover, this was the first time they had such a close contact, but the more so, the more afraid they were. The appearance of Hela had already made them feel full of crisis. But compared with the mysterious man, it was not even 1/10, and their DNA was frantically reminding them to run away. They could even feel that as long as this person wanted, he could tear them apart at any time. The more so, the more solemn their expressions became, but they did not dare to make any moves and could only stare at the figure. Only Wanda secretly breathed a sigh of relief when she saw this person. Hood actually came. She knew very well that when Hood appeared, they would definitely not continue to fight. As long as Hood was willing, he could even easily control everyone present. At the same time, she couldn't help but feel a little excited. Hood still came over at such a distance, which meant that Hood really cared about her. But the next second, she suddenly noticed something wrong. Wait, why did Hood call Hela, the goddess of death? She had just heard Thor's story on the plane, and she didn't expect that this terrifying existence was also subdued by Hood. And she didn't know why. She always had a very strange idea. Could it be that Hood and Hela, the goddess of death, were also having an affair? At the same time, Hood was looking at the people below indifferently on the high tower. Sure enough, this almost made my brain pop out. He has also watched the plot of the Avengers, but it seems that the butterfly effect caused by him has changed a lot. The most obvious thing is that there is no Spider-Man Peter Parker in this world. Although there is Gwen, for some reason, she did not get involved in this battle. And what he didn't expect was that even Thor appeared here. It only took a second to think about it, and he understood that this person was most likely sent by Odin to find the goddess of death Hela. Hela, no matter what, you can't stay on Earth. Single quote quote. Tony stared at Hela, the goddess of death, with a serious look on his face. The intact palm cannon on his left hand was ready to go. If the other party disagreed with his request, they would have no choice but to take action. Compared to Bucky, the safety of the Earth is obviously more important. None of the people from the divine realm are easy to mess with. What's more, judging from the current sense of oppression, Hela's strength is very strong. Just from the move just now, this can be fully felt. What's more, there is a mysterious man behind Hela, the goddess of death. Although this mysterious man is Wanda's boyfriend, none of them are sure whether he is a friend or an enemy. Once he is really their enemy, he can imagine how terrifying it is. Bang! Tony jumped up and jumped directly in front of everyone. The burst of power even smashed a hole in the concrete floor. Thor's hammer also floated beside him. He grabbed Thor's hammer with one hand and looked at Hela with a serious expression. Hela, you escaped the seal without permission, and your father is very angry. Hee. Father. Hela, who had been calm at first, became particularly angry after hearing these two words. You are that fool, how dare you talk to me like that? Odin, that guy, made her stay in the seal for hundreds of years. She was almost going crazy during these hundreds of years. If it weren't for the appearance of the power of the Phoenix, which allowed her to break the seal, she didn't know how long she would have to stay in that seal. Father. These two words seemed like a joke to her. You should be more respectful to father. Although you are my sister, it does not mean that I will be polite to you. Thor clenched the hammer of Thor, with lightning flashing in his eyes. He hoped that Hela could follow him back to the realm of God and wait for his father's decision. What's more, although Hela's power was terrifying, he was not necessarily afraid of Hela. A piece of trash like you, are you worthy of being my brother? Hela's smile was a little more ferocious. She snorted coldly and said, you are too weak. Let that old man Odin come and deal with me personally. Although they are both gods, she didn't even have any ripples in her eyes when it came to Thor. Instead, she looked at Thor in front of her calmly, with a little teasing and mockery in her eyes. He was just a piece of trash who was extremely weak. Naturally, she didn't have any inner fluctuations. Show me some respect. Thor, who was about to give advice, became extremely angry when he heard Hela's insult to Odin. You know, he has always respected his father, but his sister actually treated him like this. Respect? Forget about it. Hearing this, Hela sneered and continued to sneer. She never thought that he was her father, but just an old man who should have died long ago. Hod on the tower looked at this scene with a smile on his face. It has to be said that sometimes it is quite interesting to change the storyline. The reason why he brought Hela with him was also for this reason. After all, with Hela's strength, this is basically crushing everyone in the Avengers. Sure enough, only when the Avengers agree on their goals can they unite internally. Based on his understanding of the Avengers, this group of guys will only unite honestly at this time. As for what happens next, he doesn't want to get involved for the time being. Thinking of this, Hood's mouth corners slightly raised. After all, is there anything more interesting than watching a play? It's like controlling the direction of the movie by yourself, watching it happen. He couldn't help but feel that he had a bit of bad taste. This guy. Wanda looked at Hood with his hands in his pockets. Although she didn't see the expression on his face, he must be looking at everything that was happening with a mocking look. She shook her head helplessly, but she couldn't help but sigh that this was indeed a good idea. At least now everyone's attention is on Hela. Stop talking nonsense with this green-haired guy. Get started. War Machine Rod's mech instantly raised two small missiles from its shoulders, ejecting tail flames and quickly flying towards Hela. As Rod did this, at the sound, others also started to move. Hawkeye Barton shot the arrow in his hand with lightning speed. When the arrow was shot, it quickly split in the air, and it split into more than a dozen in just an instant. Tony raised his left hand, and while the palm cannon was fired, the armor behind him rose, and more than 10 small ammunition flew towards Hela in an instant. Not only that, the whole body pressed forward instantly, trying to connect with the subsequent attack. Vision rose into the air at the first time, with a golden light flashing between his eyebrows, and a laser suddenly attacked the opponent. Black Widow Natasha ran to the side, pulled out a pistol from her waist, and pulled the trigger continuously. At this moment, everyone instantly burst out with the strongest long-range attack means. They knew very well that the goddess of death Hela in front of them was not as easy to deal with as they imagined. Is that all? Hela's mouth curled up, and a disdainful smile flashed in her eyes. She swung her right hand violently, and with a flash of deep green light, the missiles in the air suddenly exploded. As for the bullets and the arrows that kept turning in the air, they stopped in the air and fell to the ground powerlessly with just a glance. At the same time, she pulled her left hand downward, and the vision suspended in the air was actually directly wrapped up by a huge force and pulled directly under the hard concrete ground. Only the bald head was exposed. Their strongest long-range attack methods were all blocked in just a blink of an eye. Take my move. Steve ran over quickly and threw the shield in his hand towards Hela. The rapidly spinning shield made a violent whistling sound in the air. And the next second, the shield was actually grabbed by Hela's hand. Shield, this little toy is quite interesting. Hela casually threw the shield into the air and hooked it with her right index finger. The shield actually flew towards Steve at a faster speed. In a flash, it was in front of Steve, and Steve's pupils dilated rapidly. He gritted his teeth and stretched out his hand to grab the flying shield, but at the moment of touching it, his pupils shrank rapidly. Bang! The shield flew backwards with Steve and hit the container not far away, leaving a big hole. Before Hela could retract her sight, Tony had already rushed towards Hela with a tail flame. Tony turned suddenly in the air, and the flame thrusters on his hands and elbows accelerated suddenly, speeding up the rotation speed. Even the armor on the hand was transformed into a black and red hammer at this time. A powerful punch slammed into Hela's head. There was a hint of excitement on the corner of his mouth, because at this distance, Hela could not dodge at all. Boom! With the loud noise, Tony widened his eyes and looked at the scene in front of him with fear. Because the attack he was most proud of was blocked by the light green film-like barrier. Hela tilted her head slightly and smiled. In an instant, the feeling of fear spread wildly in Tony's heart. Because he clearly felt that his sixth sense was frantically reminding him. And Hela was unhurried and shot in the void. Warning: the mecha is seriously damaged. The damage level is 80%. With just one blow, Tony slammed into the second floor of the airport lobby. At this time, Bucky and Natasha also came to Hela's left and right. Bucky swung his powerful metal arm violently, and a big pendulum hit Hela's abdomen, and even the sound of the air exploding could be heard. Natasha on the left pulled out a dagger from her waist, rolled forward to Hela's feet, and the sharp dagger quickly slashed towards Hela's hamstring. It can be said that at this moment, the cooperation between the two people is perfect. Because at this time it is difficult for the opponent to do two things at the same time, and even all possible dodging positions have been blocked. So, the fighting power of you Midgardians is weak. Hela shook her head helplessly, and her left foot kicked Natasha's wrist like lightning. At the same time, she swung her hand hard, and the green light swept Natasha back more than 10 meters. After rolling on the ground for more than 10 times, she barely stopped. The bright silver dagger flew into the air, and her left hand calmly aimed at the Winter Soldier Bucky on the right side of her body. Click, click, click. Bucky's face suddenly showed fear, and he suddenly saw that his metal arm was collapsing crazily. Wong Mahao. Not only that, Hela's right hand was like lightning, and she grabbed the dagger falling in the air. She stabbed Bucky's other shoulder with a knife, and kicked Bucky backwards at the same time. Take my move. Sam flew towards Hela like a sharp sword. The red wing behind him popped out and sprayed out red lasers. At some point, Black Panther also appeared behind Hela in an instant, ready to control Hela with a naked choke. As long as Sam seizes this opportunity, Hela will definitely be seriously injured. But before Black Panther touched Hela, he had already floated in the air and flew directly towards Sam in the air. The incident happened suddenly, and the mountain had no way to avoid it. It smashed down to the ground from a high altitude. Even the red wing was caught by Hela and thrown to Patton not far away. This moment happened in less than 30 seconds, and most of the Avengers members were lying on the ground. A bunch of rubbish. Hela glanced at the crowd with disdain. Boom. The sky suddenly flashed with thunder and dark clouds covered the sky. Try this trick of mine. Thor jumped high, and the lightning in the sky penetrated his body. With his strong throw, Thor's hammer flew towards Hela with lightning. Wherever it passed, the lightning of Thor's hammer would split the ground. Facing this, Hela just raised her hand curiously. Buzz. Everyone was stunned. Thor's eyes popped out. How could anyone lift Mjolnir? They stared at the scene in front of them with wide eyes. Hela actually caught Thor's hammer with one hand. He actually gave this to you, you don't deserve it. Hela looked disdainful and exerted a little force with her right hand. Countless lightning flashed, and Thor's hammer was shaking constantly. Crack, crack, countless cracks spread on Thor's hammer. And the next moment, it shattered in an instant, and countless lightning flashes burst out from it. Rumble. This thunder seemed to be the hammer's final wail. Boom. Mjolnir broke. The pieces fell all over the ground. Thor's pupils shook. How could this be possible? He knew very well that this was made of Uru metal. Not to mention taking it, he could actually crush Mjolnir directly. This was simply impossible. His mouth opened slightly, his eyes filled with complicated emotions. How could it break? Most of Tony's armor had been broken, and even the mecha mask on his head had fallen off. He supported himself on the wall and stood in the second-floor hall of the airport, fixing his eyes on the broken pieces on the ground. His pupils shrank into a slit. Even his heartbeat accelerated. He couldn't imagine how strong Hela was. You know, they fought together. Not only did they not hurt Hela at all. Even all of them fell down. Captain America had already stumbled out of the cargo box at this time. Looking at the scene in front of him, he was stunned for a moment. Although he felt a little hopeless. He had faced many powerful enemies, but this time, he actually felt powerless. Even if they attacked at the same time, they would not have the slightest chance of winning. Everyone who got up from the ground had fear on their faces, and even a little fear. Thor had boasted to them more than once before. Mjolnir in his hand was the most powerful weapon among all the weapons, and its preciousness could even be compared to his lover. But such an invincible weapon was shattered to the ground with just a light grab. Hela was actually called over by a mysterious person. How did he do it? This thought lingered in everyone's mind. Because they clearly saw Hela taking the mysterious man as the main force. The enemy's strength was too strong, and this was when the mysterious man behind him did not take action. If the mysterious man behind him took action, it would be even more unimaginable what would happen to them. They knew too little about the mysterious man. Only Wanda looked at this scene in shock. She knew very well that it was Hood, but how did Hood know the goddess of death Hela? What made her even more confused was that the goddess of death just said that she would intervene because of Hood. But why would such a powerful existence obey Hood's orders? You know, although her strength has been rising sharply, the power just now is not something she can contend with. No matter from what angle, even if she joined the battle, it would be useless. Because Hela's strength is too strong, and she is still elegant in her gestures. It seems that she already knew that she had won. All of this made her unable to understand at all. How dare you destroy Mjolnir? After Thor reacted, his eyes seemed to be spewing anger. This was his favorite weapon, and it was crushed just like that. In anger, the entire sky quickly began to change color, and for a moment it was covered with dark clouds. There was a deafening thunder in the sky. You could even see lightning moving in the sky. But without Mjolnir, he had no way to summon lightning. Thor rushed towards Hela, and every step left deep footprints on the hard ground. Die. Thor threw a punch and pressed his body down slightly, clearly intending to follow up with an uppercut. You look a bit like that old guy, but you are much weaker. Hela looked at the collapsing Thor, her voice still the same as before, with a hint of ridicule. Facing the continuous attacks, she just dodged them elegantly and calmly. The contempt in her eyes made Thor furious. He never thought that Hela's strength would be so strong. But even so, he had no intention of retreating. Instead, he attacked Hela continuously. Don't hide if you have the guts. Thor's angry voice echoed over the airport. Ha ha. Hela's mouth corners raised, and her quick expression suddenly condensed. She clenched her left fist and punched back fiercely. At the same time, her figure was like light, and she instantly appeared behind Thor. She suddenly grabbed his collar, lifted him up and pressed him hard on the ground, and ran forward quickly. In just a blink of an eye, Hela used Thor to plow a very deep ditch on the ground. After throwing it into the sky, she turned around and kicked Thor away. This set of movements was so smooth that everyone didn't even react. They saw Thor lying on the ground helplessly. Thor. Everyone was about to rush towards Hela after seeing this scene. But at this moment, Hela stretched out her hand to the sky and gently pulled. A terrifying beam of light suddenly fell from the sky. Boom! With a loud bang, everyone was instantly blown away by the beam. Even the few people who were farther away could hardly resist the impact of the beam. This horrible scene made everyone despair. They supported their painful bodies and climbed up. But because of the injuries they suffered, they couldn't even attack again. Hela's strength was too strong, so strong that they didn't even have the possibility of fighting back. Cough cough. Thor slowly got up from the ground, coughing continuously, blood seeping from the corners of his mouth. He felt severe pain all over his body. Hela's strength was far stronger than his. He even felt that the only person who could compete with him was his father Odin. Because he felt that his sister Hela's strength was not far from his father's. He finally understood why Odin told him that he only needed to report when he met Hela. Because this was not an existence he could deal with at all. You are such a waste. Hela looked at Thor, who was in such a state of disgrace, like a dog, and raised her lips slightly. But for some reason, there was a hint of jealousy in her eyes. Yes, it was an indescribable jealousy. He was just a waste. But she was actually jealous of a useless waste. I'm not a waste. Thor gritted his teeth, and the strong man climbed up from the ground in pain, roaring with an unwilling tone. He is not a waste at all, he is the strongest existence. Not a waste. Hela snorted coldly, raised her head slightly, and said in a cold voice, that old thing Odin actually wanted to make a waste like you the king. She didn't understand why such a waste could be the king. Obviously he enjoyed a lot of good resources, but in fact he was just a useless thing. She didn't even use much strength, and she easily pressed Thor to the ground. Obviously, she was the most suitable one to be the king, because only she had such a strong strength. And she couldn't accept that such a guy was actually her younger brother. I'm not. Thor gritted his teeth, clenched his fists, and had a look of unwillingness in his eyes. For the first time, he felt how weak he was. He thought he could fight Hela for 300 rounds. But he was knocked down in just one encounter. What made him even more painful was that even if he tried his best, he couldn't cause any harm to Hela. He gritted his teeth, and everything around him seemed to slow down, and light beams flashed rapidly around him. In just a moment, he appeared in front of Hela, and the huge fist wrapped in this huge force smashed towards Hela's face. But it was directly knocked off by Hela's punch, and at the same time, she grabbed Thor's neck and lifted him up. The strong feeling of suffocation made Thor unable to breathe for a while, and he could only hold Hela's right hand tightly. He wanted to forcibly pry Hela's hand open, but it was useless. My lovely and innocent brother, what kind of god are you? Where is the thunder and lightning that you are so proud of? Hela tilted her head and looked at Thor with a mocking expression. These words were like a steel needle piercing Thor's heart. Although he was the god of thunder, he couldn't even summon thunder and lightning without Mjolnir. He could only fight with his bare hands, which made him even more furious. Then, Hela threw his right hand violently. Bang! He was thrown out directly, and flew more than 10 meters before rolling on the ground for a few rounds and stopped. Puff! This powerful impact almost made Thor spit out a mouthful of blood. He never thought that the things he had been proud of were all wrong. What he couldn't accept was that he was so powerful, but he couldn't deal with his sister. So much so that he found that he couldn't hurt Hela at all no matter how hard he tried. You are the loser, Thor yelled madly, gritting his teeth as he climbed up from the ground. The lightning in the sky was still flashing, and even the dark clouds were obviously much lower than before. He suddenly got up and rushed towards Hela like crazy. The dark clouds in the sky seemed to feel Thor's anger, and even the lightning flashed more frequently. Lightning kept flashing in his pupils, and he jumped high. He felt the anger beating in his heart. But in the moment in the air, a huge force suddenly came. Hela jumped up, green light wrapped around her fist, and the next moment she knocked him flying. Thor stopped only after several warehouses were smashed. Dust and fog were everywhere, and one of the warehouses was hit and even collapsed. Countless dust was floating in the sky. Why? Thor knelt on the ground and roared in grief. He pounded the ground angrily, but his face was full of powerlessness. Although he also thought about mobilizing the lightning in the sky. But without Mjolnir, he had no way to do it. He was not even a match for Hela. Why? It's just because you are too weak. Hela looked at Thor's collapse and became more and more excited. She just wanted to see Thor's helpless look, even kneeling on the ground and wailing. At this moment, Thor actually stood up slowly. His eyeballs were full of red bloodshot. And the next second, faint lightning flashed in his eyes. He walked towards Hela step by step, and his pace became faster and faster. In the end, he even ran directly, and this extremely fast speed was wrapped with huge energy. There were even beams of light composed of thin lines pulled out around him. In just a blink of an eye, he had arrived in front of Hela, and the lightning on his body was constantly flashing and entangled. It was like a cannonball colliding with Hela. Driven by anger, Thor's strength began to rise continuously. He could already vaguely see Hela's movements, and even felt that he could keep up with Hela's speed. He swung his right fist, and his eyes flashed. Just a little bit, his hand was just a little bit away from Hela's face. This punch wrapped with huge energy even cracked the surrounding ground. At this moment, he suddenly saw a smile on Hela's lips. Puff. Then, he felt a sharp pain in his stomach. He looked down and saw that Hela had hit him in the abdomen with a hook. The next second, he felt a huge pain all over his body. With just one uppercut, he flew into the sky. Hela bent her legs slightly and jumped up from the ground. The terrifying force caused the surrounding concrete floor to crack and roll instantly. Under the influence of the beam, Hela pressed his head against the beam and rubbed it quickly. Then she grabbed his collar, made a big circle in the sky, and slammed it hard into the ground. Thor was like a meteorite, slamming into the ground. Because of the high speed, there was even fire around his body. Boom, pop, the ground cracked instantly, and a huge deep pit formed on the concrete floor 30 meters around Thor. Countless fragments flew, and even Thor's figure was embedded in the ground. Enough, stop it, Wanda couldn't help shouting as she watched Thor being beaten unilaterally. She knew very well that Horde would not let Thor die like this. But if he continued to beat him like this, even if Thor didn't die, he would become half crippled. And there was no point in going on like this. Because now even Thor had no room to resist. Click, Hela landed beside Thor, who was lying on the ground, and stepped on Thor's head with her high heels. It's no use asking me, you have to ask him. With a smile, Hela turned her head and glanced at the figure on the tower. After all, she was not the one in charge. The order she received was just to stop these people from fighting. And the easiest way to stop a fight is to knock them all down. Cough cough. At this moment, Hod on the high tower coughed lightly. With just this sound, Hela lifted her foot, smiled and stepped back a few steps. Only then could Thor, who was being stepped on, barely raise his head and gasp for breath. He didn't understand why there was such a big gap between him and his sister. It had even become one-sided abuse. Although he was able to mobilize some thunder and lightning power, he still had no way to do anything. He lay on the ground and wanted to get up, but his bones seemed to be broken. He could only turn his head and lie on the ground with resentful eyes, looking at Hela in the distance. Stupid guy, your strength will never match mine. Hela looked at Thor lying on the ground with contempt. Thor's strength was not enough to satisfy her. It can even be said that if Hood hadn't given the order, she could easily get rid of everyone present. These people were just some useless Midgardians. In her eyes, they were not even as good as a weak insect. Although Tony and others saw Thor's miserable appearance, they were already seriously injured. Take Tony for example, the mecha was almost completely damaged. It couldn't even play a role. Steve, who was not far away, could only barely get up, but there was no possibility of fighting. They could only look at the figure on the tower with despair. Under the sun, this figure looked even more mysterious. You guys, no need fighting for meaningless things. This voice seemed to ring in their minds. The figure on the tower slowly floated up, like walking upstairs, and walked slowly towards them in the void. Everyone, calm down. Hod stepped into the air and stood above everyone. They all squinted their eyes and looked up. The dazzling sun just covered Hod's head. Even if they squinted their eyes, they could only vaguely see the outline of this person's body. Even the clothes on his body could only be vaguely seen as a black suit. Who on earth is this? Tony widened his eyes. The black fog had clearly dissipated. But in his eyes, the face of the mysterious man was like a fog. No matter how he looked, he couldn't remember what this man looked like. It was a very strange feeling, as if he would forget at the moment he saw it. But even so, this man actually gave him a very familiar feeling. It was as if he had seen this person somewhere, but he couldn't remember it no matter what. The other Avengers members also tried their best to see the face clearly. But what they saw was exactly the same as Tony's. Because you can't see anything at all, even if you see it, you will forget it. As he spoke, everything around him seemed to be wrapped in a mysterious power. This power calmed down their originally restless hearts at this moment. The one who was most affected was Tony. When he felt this calmness, everything that had happened flashed before his eyes. What on earth am I doing? I obviously have many ways to solve this problem, but I chose the most radical one. This voice seemed to be able to cleanse their souls. But the more this happened, the more shocked they were. Because this power is too terrifying, let them abandon their distracting thoughts and emotions to think. As the sky shines, the figure of the mysterious man is like a dark cloud, covering their hearts. If Hela was desperate just now, then the feeling brought to them by this mysterious man is fear. This is a bottomless fear. Even Hela, who is already so strong, needs to obey this person's orders. There is only one possibility, that is, this person is much stronger than Hela. They can't even deal with Hela, let alone this mysterious man. The funny thing is that they actually held a meeting specifically for the mysterious man before. That is, once the mysterious man becomes their enemy, what method do they need to use to deal with the mysterious man? Now it seems that no matter how they struggle, they are definitely not the opponent of this mysterious man. At this time, only one person stood there well. That is Wanda. This guy still likes to pretend. Wanda looked up at Horde in the sky and shook her head helplessly. If you don't know, you might think he is a god. Oh, no. Now even Hela, the god of death, has obeyed Horde's orders. How many secrets does this guy have? He is becoming more and more mysterious. Wanda thought to herself. Every time she thought she had seen Hood clearly, she would see another veil. Buzz. Hood's right hand turned in the void, and a golden dimension door opened. A figure suddenly fell from the 3-meter-high sky. Bang! As he hit the ground heavily, he groaned in pain. When their eyes focused on this person, they found that he was a German man. However, the clothes on this German man were tattered, and even his exposed skin was covered with scars. Obviously, this person must have been beaten a lot not long ago. Otherwise, it would be impossible for him to have so many scars on his body. Haven't you been looking for the mastermind behind the scenes? This person is the mastermind behind the scenes. Hod shrugged his shoulders in the sky. He likes to watch the excitement. As a time traveler who has seen Marvel, watching the show live can add a little more fun to the boring life. What's more, if this is regarded as a movie, it is also very exciting. The mastermind behind the scenes. Tony calmed down a little before he cast his eyes on this person. He also felt that something was wrong. It was as if they were being controlled from beginning to end. Even their every move was filled with an indescribable weirdness. Although Steve might stand by his friend, the possibility of him lying was very low. Maybe it really had nothing to do with Bucky at the time. Black Panther frowned even more. He hadn't figured out what was going on yet. But listening to the mysterious man's tone, it seemed that this matter was not that simple. T'Challa, this guy was the one who planned your father's death in the explosion. However, this matter really has nothing to do with Bucky. As for the subsequent rampage of Bucky, it was also because Zemo had the hypnosis instructions left by Hydra. The reason why Zemo did this was that his family died in the Battle of Sokovia. Hod calmly explained the whole story. To be honest, Zemo is just a poor man. A mistake led to the loss of his family. It is impossible not to be angry. After learning what happened, scenes flashed in Black Panther's eyes. The veins on his forehead bulged, and his eyes were filled with endless murderous intent. If he hadn't been seriously injured, he would have wanted to tear this man named Zemo to pieces alive. Wanda and others had mixed feelings in their eyes. Because this incident was caused by them, Zemo lost his family. For a moment, everyone present fell silent, and no one spoke first. Everyone lowered their heads, just quietly, watching everything happening in front of you. This guy is left to you to deal with. After Hod finished speaking, he turned his gaze to Hela and said, "Hela, let's go." Okay. Hela nodded slightly and was about to fly into the sky, but at this moment, Thor's hoarse roar came from behind her. "Hela, Come back with me to see Odin. He shouted at the top of his lungs, while trying to endure the pain, and climbed up. Beads of sweat kept dripping down his forehead. This battle had left him seriously injured. But even so, he had no intention of stopping, but hoped that Hela would follow him back honestly. Humph, stupid. Hela snorted coldly. I go back. You ask Odin to come here in person. Otherwise, I will fight my way back to the god's domain one day. She really didn't expect that her so-called brother was so stupid. If she went back, she would never go back unless Odin gave up his position and died in front of her. The days of being sealed for hundreds of years made her angry just thinking about it. You are stubborn and you can't be your father's opponent if you continue like this. Thor covered his chest and screamed at the top of his lungs. If Odin really came, there would be only one possibility for Hela, and that was death. That would be even better. He'd better kill me, or I'll kill him. After saying this lightly, Hela flew straight towards Hod in the air. She was no longer willing to talk to this weak man. Even if this man was her brother, strength was the final word. Ah! Thor gritted his teeth, and the gaps between his teeth were filled with scarlet blood. His legs were bent, the veins on his thighs were bulging, and his eyes were filled with anger. This time his target was no longer Hela, but the mysterious man who was high above him. Although he didn't know why Hela would listen to this mysterious man, he was willing to fight to the death. Thor, don't go over there, come back soon. You are no match for him. Quote. The Avengers all had anxious looks on their faces. No one had expected that Thor would fight to the death at this time. He was no match for Hela, let alone this mysterious man. As the figure got closer and closer, lightning shone on Thor's fist. He still has the strength. Hodder lowered his head and looked at Thor, who was rushing towards him, and couldn't help but raise the corners of his mouth. The physical fitness of the people in the god's realm is indeed good. Even after being beaten like this, they can still struggle and resist. He pressed down with his right hand slightly, and an indescribable pressure instantly enveloped Thor. He immediately felt an extremely terrifying force pressing down from above. Whoosh! Bang! With a loud bang, Thor was pulled into the ground. Only a head was exposed on the ground. Crack, crack, crack. The surrounding ground began to shrink and trapped Thor firmly on the ground. Stupid. Hod looked at Thor, who was dragged away. Friday, did you detect anything? Tony asked, gritting his teeth while pressing down on the damaged ear mecha that was about to fall off at any time. Boss, after testing, the power is consistent with the residual power of the last earthquake. When Friday reported the news, Tony's expression became extremely ugly. He had felt that the earthquake was wrong before, so he checked. But he found that it did not match the mysterious man before, so he did not suspect the mysterious man. But he never thought that the mysterious man actually possessed such a terrifying power at the same time. That was an 8-magnitude earthquake. This is already a force that can easily destroy a city. This made Tony look at Hood with more fear and fear. This person is equivalent to a natural disaster in the world. It can even be said that with their power, it is impossible to deal with such a monster. Let's go. Hodder waved his right hand, and a golden dimensional gate suddenly appeared above him. Then a golden halo passed in front of the two of them and disappeared instantly. Looking at the back of the departing figure, everyone present couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. It was so dangerous just now, that goddess of death was so terrifying. What's even more terrifying is that mysterious man. We don't even know his purpose. Zero, please give me flowers. But it seems like he wants to help us, but this is not the way he wants to help us. I can't think of anything in the world that can check and balance him. Quote. The Avengers all collapsed on the ground, secretly sighing that they had survived a disaster. Although the mysterious man just now did not release any magic, his mere appearance had already frightened them to the extreme. If the goddess of death Hela and the others could grit their teeth and attack, then they did not even have the courage to attack this mysterious man. Even the strange power could change their emotions and calm them down. The more this happened, the more they could feel the gap in strength between the two sides. It's finally over. Tony casually pulled off one of the broken pieces of his armor and sat on the ground with a tired face. But he couldn't help but sigh that if it weren't for the appearance of this mysterious man, he didn't know what would happen next. Everyone rested for a long time, and Tony stood up and walked towards Steve. When they saw Tony's action, the Avengers, who had been relaxed, suddenly became nervous. No one knew what would happen next. Tony took the lead and walked to Steve, who was leaning on the iron plate of the warehouse, and stretched out his right hand. Steve looked up at Tony with an incredible look on his face. When he saw Tony's smile, he suddenly grabbed Tony's right hand and stood up. "Captain, I did something very stupid. I apologize to you." Tony took a deep breath and apologized. "If you can think about it carefully, there is no need to fight internally. I was too impulsive in this matter. Ross really made me." Steve shook his head and admitted his mistake. "After all, we were all teammates on the same team, so there was no need to make such a fuss." "Okay, stop talking." Natasha walked between the two of them, stroked her hair and said excitedly, "Bring the person to Ross, and go back to the party." Anyway, they completed the task perfectly this time. Looking at the people who had reconciled, Wanda's mouth corners also slightly raised. This was the scene she wanted to see most. After returning to the Avengers base. After simply cleaning up their wounds, everyone sat around the dining table. Everyone seemed to be in a good mood, only Thor was in a low mood and biting a cookie. "Wanda, who is your boyfriend?" Tony couldn't help but ask. He actually guessed that the other party came to help them. Otherwise, Zemo wouldn't have been caught, and he wouldn't have figured out everything. But the more he thought about it, the more curious he became about this person's identity. What kind of person would make the goddess of death Hela obey him? I don't know what to say. I'll take him back sometime." Wanda looked a little confused. Although they have confirmed their relationship now, Hood's relationship is really too messy. She now doubts whether Hood has subdued the goddess of death Hela. "I hope that day will come soon. I will prepare a grand banquet." Tony's face showed excitement, because this mysterious man was so powerful. If he could become one of their own, it would make their Avengers even stronger. "Everyone, I won't eat for now, I need to go to the god's domain." Thor stuffed a waffle into his mouth and suddenly stood up. Then, without caring about others, he jumped out of the window. Looking at Thor's disappearing back, everyone sighed helplessly. They also saw that Thor had suffered a great blow this time. "God's domain, Asgard, have you seen her?" Odin looked at the dejected Thor and vaguely guessed what had happened. But he was not surprised. His son still had great potential. It was natural that he could not deal with Hela now. "I saw it, but Hela. It seems that she is working for a Midgardian." Thor told Odin everything that happened to him. The more he listened, the more shocked Odin became. He knew very well how proud Hela was, but she actually succumbed to others and even became a big hand. You know, he himself couldn't make Hela surrender, even if he sealed her up. If this is the case, then the person who helped Hela escape is likely to be that mysterious person. Odin gave his own conclusion. "After all, this possibility is very high. Father, what should I do next?" Thor gritted his teeth and looked at Odin unwillingly. Odin did not speak, but after a long silence, he spoke. "The mysterious Midgardian you mentioned is very powerful. I am afraid I am the only one who can go and meet him. I hope everyone will support it and subscribe more."